Official report. Okay. Good morning and welcome to the 17th meeting in 2025 of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. We have received apologies from Ross Greer. The first item on our agenda today is to take evidence from the Scottish Government on the Scottish budget process in practice. I welcome to the meeting Shona Robeson, Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Local Government, who is joined by Scottish Government officials, Alistair Black, Deputy Director, Budget and Fiscal Coordination, and Jamie McDougall, Deputy Director, Spending and Pay Strategy. I intend to allow around 90 minutes for this session, and before I open up discussion, I invite Ms Robeson to make a short opening statement.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning to everyone. Let me say I welcome the opportunity to meet today to support your inquiry into the budget process in practice. You've heard from a wide range of stakeholders as part of your work so far, and I'm pleased this has included recognition of the significant progress and improvements that we've made over the course of this parliamentary session. These improvements include transparency and comparability of financial information, supporting public discourse and stakeholder engagement both as part of the budget process and also throughout the year. This progress reflects our commitment to continuous improvement, the important scrutiny role undertaken by Parliament and of course the work of this committee, and the very high quality of contributions and engagements from across civic society, for which I'm very grateful. We have come a long way, I think, from the work of the Budget Process Review Group in 2017 and from the finalisation of the written agreement with an increasingly complex fiscal landscape. And this has included many unforeseeable fiscal challenges, which this government has addressed through deploying the fiscal levers we have at our disposal. My meaningful engagement with this committee and providing sufficient clarity to you is often, I'm afraid, not helped by the approach of UK Government ministers towards devolved governments. My counterparts in devolved governments and I called on the Treasury to involve us at an early stage in the UK spending review and offered to work with them on areas of shared priority and common cause. However, the Treasury's response has been somewhat disappointing and, frankly, a missed opportunity to develop a new approach. In particular, and as I set out to you in detail in my letter last week, the Treasury has not prioritised meetings with ministers from devolved governments. The Treasury has refused further ministerial engagement and will not provide meaningful clarity on spending priorities across Whitehall departments until after the UK spending review has completed. This means that we will not have satisfactory clarity about the UK spending review's implications for Scotland in advance of its 11th of June publication, and explains the difficult decision that I took to delay the publication of the MTFS. I appreciate the difficulties that this causes the committee, and I'm committed to working with you to mitigate that impact. Publishing the MTFS after the UK spending review will therefore allow reflection of the spending review outcome and provide a more robust central funding outlook, which is key to our financial strategy and delivery plan. And I'll set out the actions this government will take to deliver progress in the accompanying fiscal sustainability delivery plan. I am pleased to announce to the committee today that I will publish a framework for the next Scottish spending review as part of the MTFS. This will set out the proposed timeline for our spending review and the approach we will take in analysing budgets and spending proposals. I intend for the approach to be anchored by the 4 priorities of this government and the need to ensure that Scotland's finances are sustainable. Given the committee's views to date and that of our stakeholders, I am considering publishing the conclusions of the Scottish Spending Review and the Infrastructure Pipeline Reset in December alongside the 2026-27 budget. This will allow us to present the Scottish Government's medium-term financial plans after we receive key funding information from the UK Government in their own spending review, and I plan to provide formal confirmation of the timeline to the committee in writing in due course ahead of publication of the framework, but I'd welcome views from the committee on this proposed timing or on other aspects of the spending review. So thanks again, Convener, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, and obviously I'll be touching on your letter in the MTFS shortly, actually, but I want to go into other areas which we've deliberated over in terms of a report. I mean, you rightly talked about the improvements that the Scottish Government has delivered in terms of budget transparency in recent years. I mean, not least in terms of the quality of spring and autumn budget revisions. But there is still obviously some areas where I think the Government can continue that improvement. So, for example, more transparency and consistent presentation is required, particularly in relation to year-end transfers. I mean, I have raised on a number of occasions with ministers the issue of the fact that we still see the same sums of money being transferred from the same portfolios to other portfolios every single year, when in actual fact it seems to me nonsensical that it shouldn't be in the portfolio to which they're transferred from the beginning. I think there's politics behind that. I think because of the portfolios concerned, people might say that money is being cut from one budget and put in another when in actual... so I understand there's that, but I think if that is the case, the Government should just kind of be clear about that, frankly, because it's a nonsensical that we see that. We also see issues which I've raised over the years, for example, in public-private partnership sums. I've raised in the last couple of years the fact that they were in the roads budget, £133 million, if memory serves me right, of PPP payments in the trunk road budget, but they don't appear in it to any degree anywhere else. So what we're looking for is to ensure that the budget is much clearer, much more transparent, and I think that will aid the kind of public and stakeholders and anyone else who takes an interest in that. And finally, just on this transparency issue, I'm sure you'd agree that more detailed information on pay and workforce is required, given the huge proportion of the overall budget that makes up.
Well, look, I'm always up for discussions about further progress and how that can be made, and keen to have further engagement on the detail, convener, of some of the areas that you've raised. And in terms of the in-year transfers, the only point I would make, and I've made this point before, is quite often the policy direction will sit in one area, but the delivery will sit in another. So if you have the policy being set by education, for example, but the delivery being through local government is one example. There are many others. There is then a tension between the policy and the delivery. So if all of the money was essentially transferred at the start, where does that leave policy decisions around that area of government?
No, but accept that if it wasn't for the fact that the policies you put, it doesn't seem to change year on year. If it happens for 5 or 6 or 7 years in a row, then that argument doesn't stack up. I mean, I can understand, and we do understand that changes have to be made mid-year. That's why we have the autumn and spring revisions. But when you see the same resource effectively shifting from the same budget every year, then I don't think that's in any way appropriate. What people want to do is just be able to track where the money goes effectively.
Well, let me be helpful and say, look, I'm very keen to work with the committee further on those areas, and maybe there's an ability to make a distinction of those areas that are settled in a way and those areas that are more prone to policy shifts, which might shift the funding level. So we can have a look at that. I mean, your point about PPP, I recognise your frustration in terms of that being reflected. We can, again, have further discussion with the committee around that. In terms of pay and workforce, so the fiscal sustainability delivery plan will have quite a sharp focus on workforce, and you'll be able to see some of the detail of what those projections look like when that is published. Pay is a huge element of the budget, clearly, and again, if there are ways of being able to be more transparent around the costs of that, the budgeting for it, then again, I'm very open to looking at that. I'm not shutting the door on any of these ideas, Convener. It's just if there are more specific suggestions the committee want to make in these areas or others, I'm very happy to look at them in advance of 26-27.
Okay, I mean, some of the evidence we took from witnesses suggested that there was a kind of, you know, wonderment as to why we were even having a fiscal sustainability plan as opposed to just having it within the medium-term financial strategy. So Fraser Valander, for example, they thought a separate document was unnecessary. So why is such a document necessary? Because one of the things that we hear frequently from witnesses is the plethora of plans and strategies the government has. Now, I can understand, you know, you would have quite a plethora across the government, but in finance alone, it seems there always seems to be plans and strategies, and they don't always seem to be joined up. So I think one of the issues that we've received comment on is that it would be much better if there was greater clarity on how these strategies join up, or even better if there was one overarching strategy which incorporated everything, as opposed to these seeming kind of different plans and strategies that all seem to run in different directions.
Well, the aim of the Fiscal Sustainability Delivery Plan is to bring all of the component parts across government into one place where Parliament, the committee, others, external stakeholders can see the actions that we're setting out, the pillars of the plan, and for then that to be tracked in terms of delivery. So it is an attempt to make that more transparent and accessible. And you know, I'll be able to set out what the review processes that we're suggesting will be. So it will be very much linked clearly to MTFS, but it will be a document that is focused on the how and the what, and being able to put some timeframes against some of that delivery of the actions we need to take.
Well, timeframes I think is really important, because that was what I was going to ask you about next. I mean, one of the issues about reform is we hear from the government about the plans for reform, but we don't necessarily get detail on what is to be reformed by which date. It seems to be that it seems to be a kind of movable feast. And I always think about, you know, my tax return. The reason I file it at the end of January is because the deadline's the end of January. If it was end of February, I'd probably do it at the end of February. There's always something else to do. And it seems to me that if you have a situation whereby you don't have deadlines, things just drift. And one of the issues that we've actually seen quite consistently is drift. It never seems to be that when documents are due, that they arrive ahead of time or on time. There always seems to be some drift in that, and of course that's the same with the medium-term financial strategy. I mean, one of the things that it has also come out, of course, is that when the Scottish budget is delivered, there doesn't seem to be detail on what the outcomes is it's trying to achieve. So it's a kind of two-dimensional document in which, you know, we see the figures in certain portfolios either going up, staying the same, or going down, years, but not about what is trying to be achieved. And you know, you valiantly try in a 20 or 30-minute statement to actually put that on the record, but you can't possibly get that detail in. Now, I don't think anyone wants to see a 500-page document. 140 pages is sufficient, but I think there is room, I think, for more detail in terms of outcomes, but particularly linking in with the National Performance Framework to see how they kind of tie in, because again there's a kind of view that they don't seem to correlate as well as they perhaps should.
Obviously, the NPF is under review at the moment, and I think it is important that all of these elements are coherent for a start. With the point about reform and tangible timeframes, outcomes is an important one. That will be a key pillar of the Fiscal Sustainability Plan, and it will again show what needs to happen in terms of being able to ensure that we can manage to reduce our pressures, that we are able to do things differently and extract benefit from that. And I think that point about outcomes is a good one. I mean, there are a lot of documents that that are at a much kind of more granular detail that focused on outcomes. So I guess if you look at Verity House or Health Board plans, for example, there'll be more there around the outcomes at that level. But I take your point. I think we can and should be able to describe more readily the outcomes that we'd expect from the investment. So if you take keeping children out of poverty through the investments in Scottish Child Payment, and we've put figures on that over the years through analysis of how many children will that impact. We did the same. I described a previous session around the lifting of the two-child cap, how many children we expected that to impact in terms of keeping them out of poverty. So in some areas we have an analysis that is able to focus more on outcomes. But I do take the point more generally. I think we could we can make improvements there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about inconsistency, really, because, I mean, you're absolutely right to hit on the issues in terms of the Scottish Child Payment. There's a lot been said about that, but if outcomes can be tied to priorities, then it's a lot easier for ourselves and indeed others to scrutinise whether the government is actually meeting the priorities it's set for itself. And it's a good discipline, I think, for the government itself to see that it's the allocation of resources doing exactly what it kind of says on the tin. One of the issues that, that's been raised as well, and in fact we saw it when we were in Estonia, when we talked to government officials there, is about zero-based budgeting, like every decade or so. Should there kind of been almost like a refresh to say, well, why are we doing this? Well, because we've always done it. But what the value of that actually is, to see that we get better bang for the buck, is that something that the government would actually consider? I
mean, it's something we shouldn't discount. I guess the starting point is usually the baselines for the obvious reason. If you look at the devolved spend, so much of it is tied up in parcels that are the big chunks of spend, so health, local government, social security. Now, you could, if you were to take a zero-based budgeting position, you would very quickly, I think, with health, reach a position where, okay, so in order to keep the service functioning, it requires this level of funding. Should that mean we shouldn't ask ourselves some fundamental questions about, what are the outcomes for the chunk of funding to local government, health, social security, and then everything else? I think we should ask ourselves those questions. We have attempted previously to have quite a lot of challenge in the system about why are we spending money on that, what does it deliver? I think it is quite difficult, though, to start with a blank sheet of paper when you have systems that you need to operate. People expect to receive their services on, there can't be a pause to all of that. So there's some essential spend.
Down for a month while they're actually doing that. But they
have more scope because they don't have the
private companies do it all the time. I mean, at the end of the day, if you've got a budget of £64 billion, even if 1% of that is not being allocated efficiently, that's a lot of money. And it's just going back to first principles and saying, look, is this what we're actually trying to achieve from this spend, and are we actually achieving it? So that's really about it.
I mean, the spending review might provide an opportunity to look a bit more broadly at the current, but also look into the future around, if we can use digital investment, for example, could help with reform and transformation. How are we embedding that? Does that mean then that things might be delivered a bit differently? But it's not that I'm against attempting it at all. It's just I think very quickly, given the limited room for manoeuvre of large chunks of money, it would be quite challenging, I think. Okay,
thanks. Now, just a couple of more points before then I'll talk about the letter. I mean, COSLA and the Scottish Trade Union Congress have basically said that early engagement could better inform Scottish Government's public sector pay. assumptions and indeed help with the local authorities with the planning. I'm sure other colleagues will talk about that kind of issue in some depth as we progress. But I'm just wondering whether, if that's a matter the Scottish Government is looking at in terms of engagement. And just on the back of that, in terms of pre-budget process, this committee takes a lot of evidence in pre-budget process, and we obviously produce a report. And what I would say was, what impact does that have? What has the Scottish Government changed, for example, as a result of the work that's being done in terms of pre-budget scrutiny?
So I have a lot of engagement, particularly with COSLA, on a regular basis about pay and many other matters pertaining to the funding of local government. It was a far deeper pre-budget engagement, which I think even COSLA themselves recognise that it was better this year. Maybe not perfect, but better. STUC, similarly, I had meetings with them and other and individual unions as well around trying to set some expectations around pay, given the constraints that there are. In terms of things that have changed, I mean, I'd like to think that there is an iteration of every budget process in the light of what we've heard. The local government one is a good example. I think hearing their experiences of what didn't work has led to a far more open book approach for 25-26. So I guess I would cite that as a strong example of where we listened and decided to work with them in an open book approach was a much better way of getting to a place that they were more comfortable and content with, maybe not entirely happy with it, absolutely everything, but I think we got to a far better place.
Okay, thank you. Now, in terms of the medium-term financial strategy, obviously we understood in January when the date of the, the UK spending review was set, then so would be the medium-term financial strategy. But in your letter, so we were quite surprised when there was a change in the date. However, what you're basically saying is that the reason for this is because the UK government, despite its, its assertions that it's going to work more closely with the Scottish Government and reset things from its predecessor, has in this instance not done so. And you specifically mention the Chief Secretary for the Treasury and his lack of engagement with devolved parliaments.
Well, yeah, I think I was very optimistic originally because it was a pretty low bar in terms of the flow of information. And as I've said to this committee before, I think the flow of information significantly improved and relationships significantly improved. And some of that still remains the case. And I guess, to be blunt, because of that, I expected us to have near spot-on information being shared around the spending review outlook, not least that we would have some direct engagement through FISC and bilaterals that would give us certainty, because they knew what the timeline was for MTFS, that they would be able to give us that degree of confidence. I have to say the meeting that we had, that was not a FISC, it was a meeting with all of the devolved administrations along with the Secretaries of State, and it was a meeting where, for example, asking questions around what are the spending department priorities, which departments are likely to be prioritised over others. It was essentially what is in the public domain and nothing more. And then when there was a decline to have any bilaterals because the Chief Secretary said there was no time to have any bilaterals because he was tied up with bilaterals with Whitehall departments, which wouldn't conclude until the end of May. We made the point, well, the outcome of those discussions is going to determine the funding envelopes for the devolved administrations. After that meeting, I had a growing unease and receding lack of confidence, not least when you think about the defence announcement as well. So this sign of shifts in spend, but not being able to have any level of detail of what that was. At one point, we asked whether, well, there was a kind of vague offer of, if you give us some broad envelopes, we'll maybe tell you if those are in the right ballpark. Even then, they were saying they probably couldn't do that until the end of May, possibly early June. So in the light of all of that, I'm afraid I concluded that out of a difficult set of options, it was the primary overriding consideration for me had to be the accuracy of information. And I wasn't confident I could provide accurate information at the end of May in advance of the 11th of June, and then would have to immediately revisit the information 2 weeks later, potentially, with it being not accurate. So, I mean, I understand, the concern of the committee around the terms of the written agreement, but I had to make a judgment about what was paramount here, and I felt accuracy of information was paramount, and we just don't have that at the moment.
I mean, I know last summer and autumn and into the winter you were saying how relationships had improved. So there's obviously concern if they haven't. I have to say that on the 29th of March, this committee and our Welsh and non-Irish counterparts had a meeting with the Chief Secretary of the Treasury. It was meant to be in person. It was changed a few days beforehand to an online meeting of 45 minutes. Then on the day it was reduced to 30 minutes, and then when he came on it was reduced to actually less than 15 minutes. And there were 11 political parties there who wanted to engage, and we couldn't. And in fact, his own political party was probably the most critical of that engagement. So, do you think it's a wider issue with UK Treasury, or specifically with the CST, or because I mean, obviously we've got concerns if this is going to be an ongoing situation. We don't want relationships to deteriorate as the months and years progress.
Oh, no, we don't. And I guess, I don't know, maybe there was a bit of a kind of a flush of a new relationship of doing things differently, and it was all felt very positive, and it just seems to have waned. Actually, I was genuinely surprised, as were others, when we sat at the meeting in April, and we were told point blank there was no time for any bilateral meetings with the devolved administrations. Now, we felt it was important to have parity with Whitehall departments, of having that direct, and that we would get the information, enough of information that we would require. And, well, it's landed quite badly, I have to say.
So let me get this clear. Your view is that the devolved administrations are being treated with less respect, or given less attention than UK Whitehall departments? Well,
we've not been offered a meeting comparable to the Whitehall departments, who are going to be, meeting throughout May, and we understand the time pressures of that. I understand the time it takes to have meetings with all of the respective parts of government, so I know that takes time, but it just was a bad message to send. And that was, I felt, was going to be the opportunity to get, in confidence, an understanding of that we were in,
basically, yeah,
that we were in the right place.
Yeah, okay.
And we just haven't had that. Now, going forward, I wouldn't want to. So I think it's important we have a protocol with Treasury, and that has been good with the flow of information more generally, and I wouldn't want to, I think that's important. That has been an important improvement, and we value that. But I think there's work to be done here to rebuild a bit of confidence, to be honest.
Well, the committee itself was written to the CST in terms of our own engagement with them, so I understand where you are with that. Just one final thing before opening up, because I know other colleagues are going to ask questions about this and the wider issues we're deliberating over this morning, which is, you said the Prime Minister's announcement on prioritisation of defence spending was a significant development which came after your original decision on the date of the MTFS. What about the statement in March as well? Is that likely to have much impact?
Well, I think there's just I had a general sense of shifting spend that we had no line of sight of what does that mean. So when we asked, could he give us a sense of the spending departments that were likely to be prioritised and protected compared to those that are not. So, for example, we don't know where local government is going to sit in terms of the Whitehall department priority. Is it going to be a... And there was just no... Well, like you say, I've got to meet with them all. And but they must have some sense at this stage of... So I just think all of it was a bit of a shift from what the assumptions we had made to where we are now, just as a different place, unfortunately. OK, let's open out the session. First person to ask questions will be Michael, to follow by Liz.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. You've touched on some issues already about the advice that you take around the budget, and I wondered about the tax advisory group. Dan Needle, who is a member of that group, said regarding your changes to income tax, what did the tax advisory group make of the 48p increase? The answer is nothing, because nobody asked us. The decision was pure politics. Why would you not ask a tax advisory group commissioned and chaired by you what their views were on your tax policy? Well,
the tax advisory group, and we were really clear about this with the members of the tax advisory group and in the public communications, was not a group that we would be saying to them, we're going to, this is our tax policy for the budget. Apart from anything else, I think if I was to do that before informing Parliament, I think I would get myself into some difficulty. The tax advisory group were not a group that we would be essentially consulting over the tax rates for each budget. That was made very clear with the tax advisory group at the start. What we were working with the tax advisory group on was things, for example, about the public's understanding of tax, areas that we could improve around that, and making sure that we were looking at all of the component parts in the here and now, and what areas in the future that we would potentially look at. So I think that essentially that's my response. I would not have been telling the tax advisory group around our proposals for tax, because that would not be right. Parliament should hear those first and foremost.
But you wouldn't take any expert advice then on that tax rate? Or...
Well, we take advice from the Scottish Fiscal Commission, so we will give them the information and what we were looking at, and we'll give them various options, and they'll come back with what that means in terms of revenue raised. They will potentially, and things like behaviour change. We'll also look at HMRC data. So we will look at all of these things. But the SFC is the main body that we will have the analysis done in advance of making decisions.
So in the terms of reference for the tax advisory group, it says the group will advise on the development of a tax system that's fit for purpose, deliver sustainable public finance, supports high quality public services, flourishing economy. The group should consider the total tax burden, including relationship between local and national devolvement reserve taxation, many other ideas at further discussion. I mean, it's clearly not Mr Needle's view that, as a member of it, that they should not have been consulted on such a significant change on tax. So will you be advising him further as to our other members of the group that they were wrong?
Oh, we were really clear with the tax advisory group about the role of the group and what it would do and what it would not do. So looking at areas of tax behaviour, and all of that in a general sense, and getting advice. We had differing views in the room. So the SDUC had a view around the role of tax and the tax burden compared to some of the business organisations. And so those were important discussions. How can the public be made more aware of tax? That helps in terms of tax. People adhering to their tax liabilities, and we looked. So there were some very, very important discussions and pieces of work that were undertaken. But it was never a group that would be consulted and asked about a specific rate of tax, because that wouldn't be appropriate. Parliament is the place that hears about the government's position on tax. Not an advisory group, because the risk would have been that what the government's tax proposals could be in the public domain before Parliament hears about them. And I think I would have been getting into some significant difficulty.
When did the group last meet?
Can give a...
I think the last published minutes are from November of last year.
Yeah.
So are there any meetings planned for this year?
So one of the things we were looking at was the future of the advisory group and what role it would have going forward. And at the last meeting, and I can write just with the further detail on this, I recollect that I was asking them about the future of the group in terms of its role going forward, what might be appropriate given the position that we had reached. And I think that discussion is still ongoing, but I'll write to the committee with an update
because
of where we've got to.
Under the terms of reference, it's meant to meet 4 times a year. We're now in, well, let's call this mid-May. It's not met at all this year.
Well, that, as I say, the future...
Sure. Do you think its work's completed?
Well, some parts of the work of the advisory group were completed, but is there more work to be done? Because the tax strategy was published, clearly that was an important milestone, and the advisory group had a lot of key input into that. So that was a product from that work, and I think that was really, there was a natural point then to discuss what's the future of the advisory group. So, for example, there is a lot of interest in new taxes going forward. Is there a role for the advisory group looking at, for example, what some of those may be? There's a lot of interest in local government taxation. So, but that discussion is ongoing.
And no meeting scheduled, as far as you're aware?
No, but I will come back to the committee with the latest on the review.
I'll move on. Thank you.
Okay.
The advice from the Scottish Fiscal Commission, I was interested on the 1st of April, Graham Roy told our committee that in regards to full fiscal autonomy, the stated policy of the government, that the Scottish Fiscal Commission had not been asked to do any work at all on that. We've had no instructions on that, so we have not looked at anything like full fiscal autonomy. Would it not be best, if this is the policy of the government as you set out to the Scottish Affairs Committee, that you take some professional advice as to what the implications of that might be?
Well, look, I think as Angus Robertson replied to you, I think it was just last week, on this matter, and he said that the Scottish Government stands ready to engage at any point with the UK Government on substantial new fiscal powers for Scotland, following which will model the impact of potential policy choices. We are ready to engage in looking at full fiscal autonomy if the UK Government is open to engage with us in terms of the detailed work on that. We've asked for a proper review of the fiscal framework beyond just around the margins, and we've asked Treasury to have a more fundamental review of the fiscal framework. As yet, we've not had any indication that the UK Government would be up for a more general, wider review, but we'll continue to pursue that.
What would the fiscal impact be?
Well, we would have to do the detailed work at a point in time. Clearly, a point in time 10 years ago, 5 years ago now would depend on the financial circumstances. And we would do that detailed work with the UK Government at a point that, if they were serious about wanting to engage with us around that,
you don't know? You don't know. So the policy today, but you don't know what the fiscal impact of it would be.
Well, no detailed work has been taken out on the basis of where we are at the moment and the fiscal position. That work's not been done. It would be done with the UK government if we reach an agreement that work should be undertaken.
So as a point, I suppose, of the mechanical principle of this, you're pursuing, this is the area of policy that you're pursuing with the UK government and your view of the way that the fiscal framework should be the destination, but you don't have any idea as to what the fiscal impact of it would be?
Well, it depends what's on the table. So if we're saying there are specific tax powers that we're going to look at, or specific areas of devolution of areas of spend that we don't have, or powers over of corporation tax, for example, or other taxes, we would have to know what's on the table at this discussion with the UK government in order to model what that would mean. The principle of full fiscal autonomy, I mean, we've never hidden away from the fact that we want independence and anything short of that in terms of powers for this Parliament. I mean, it's not a secret. But in terms of the detailed financial modelling and economic modelling, that would have to be done on the basis of what it is we're talking about. So if we did the framework, for example, if there was a framework review that got into the detail of what those areas are that would move and shift and be devolved, at that point the detailed analysis would be done on each of those pillars of tax powers that would be moving to the Scottish Parliament. But at the moment, it's a principle, but we would have to have we would have to discuss and do the detailed work on what we were discussing and what we had agreed with the UK government. There's nothing agreed with the UK government.
So on the basis of the principle, David Phillips of the IFS has said that full fiscal autonomy would likely entail substantial spending cuts or tax rises in Scotland. There's some expert advice. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think if you base it on the current constitutional arrangements and you look at GERS, for example, we have this annual debate about GERS because that's based on the current constitutional arrangements, not the opportunity that would come from Scotland being able to make its own decisions on tax, on using economic levers that we don't currently have. And goodness, if we ever needed an example of why that matters, we can see what's happened to the fishing industry this week. So, these are points of principle that we clearly, disagree with. You're not in favour of the movement of any further powers to Scotland. I take a very, very different view. Where we would get into the detailed work is on what we're talking about. So, for example, if the UK government was willing, as part of a more general review of the fiscal framework, we would then identify what powers and levers we're talking about. And at that point, we would be able to do the detailed work of what does that mean under the current arrangements, what does that mean for Scotland. But in the absence of any of that, it's a principle that we adhere to.
So those GERS figures for 23-24, the net fiscal balance was minus £22.7 billion.
Under the current constitutional arrangements, which actually says quite a lot, so doesn't it, about the current constitutional arrangements?
10.4% of GDP. I mean, that's, you're saying the short of the move to independence, the assignation of the fiscal side of this. The expert opinion that we have on this as a shift in the Constitution is that it would have very significant negative effects. Well, but you're acting on this to pursue this on the basis of no analysis that's been undertaken by your government, despite the fact that these are your figures in terms of the GERS figures.
Well, the GERS figures are under...
Excuse me a second. We are drifting quite significantly away from the actual issue that we're supposed to be taking evidence on.
Let me just put on the record, though, Convener, the GERS figures are on the current constitutional arrangements and all of the constraints of the current constitutional arrangements. It takes no account of the use of levers that we would have as an independent Scotland, or indeed with additional economic levers. And the current constitutional arrangements, I think GERS demonstrates the constraints of it very well.
Okay, I appreciate that, Convener. Exploring the issue of...
I
understand
stick to the Scottish budget process.
I'll leave it at that point. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you then. Liz, to be followed by John.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary, just dealing with the facts about the current settlement. The Scottish Fiscal Commission, as I understand it, which we have great respect for right across the Parliament, but particularly in this committee, they set out the facts of where we are when it comes to predictions, as well as what the current situation is. They are not allowed to advise on government policy. That's a matter entirely for yourself. When it comes to the advice that you take about trying to address the concerns of the Fiscal Commission statistics, who is it that is giving you that advice?
In terms of what we should accept or not accept
Correct.
from the Scottish Fiscal Commission. So, well, the Scottish Fiscal Commission will give us options based on what we ask them to analyse. So, for example, if it was on tax, there would be potentially ranges that we would give them. On workforce assumptions, they would model that, and we would then have choices to make based on the information that we get. Options would then be put to me from my finance officials using the SFC information, and it would be, well, if you do that, this is these are the implications, this is the effect, and we then have to make judgments about what we think is...
So how does the tax strategy group have input to that?
Well, the tax advisory group were looking at the tax position overall. So, for example, there were a number of themes that they were looking at. They were looking at the public's understanding of tax, the coherence of tax in terms of making sure that you raise the public's understanding. Are they more liable to then adhere and pay their taxes? That the burden of tax, so that we had a look at some of the HMRC data about behavioural issues. So it was more in the general sense rather than specific rates of, you know.
Yeah, I understand that, but that's actually interesting because if they are providing some advice about behavioural changes, then that surely is extremely important for any decision that the government comes to about the strategy that will provide you with extra revenue in order to control public finances. That's surely important. What I think we're getting at is how easy is it for you, as the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, to be able to take on board the facts that the Fiscal Commission has given you, but also the advice, and it is advice, that your tax group is providing, particularly as that includes behavioural change, which, if you look at what the Fiscal Commission is saying, is absolutely crucial to the amount of revenue that you're likely to bring in, not just now, but in years hence.
I take the point. The only thing I would say is that I think you just need to bear in mind the dynamics of who's sitting around the table in the tax advisory group. So you would have, on the one hand, the STUC with a particular view of what they thought should happen vis-à-vis tax, which was very, very different from business organisations sitting around the table. So they're going to say very, very different things to me. Then you had the tax experts who were, you know, a bit more dispassionate, I guess, around, you know, their view of behaviour. And then you had local government with its own view. So there's not one view emanating from that advisory group. There were a range of views, and what I tried to do was to, and through the tax strategy, we collectively tried to do was to pull in as much of that as we could into a coherent strategy. But you know, many of those views were not going to be able to be reconciled.
No, I understand that, and probably not reconciled at all. But obviously, you have to make a decision about which are the ones that you find most important in terms of setting your policy, and that has to articulate, I would hope, with the information that is provided by the Scottish Fiscal Commission and indeed the other economic forecasters. And I think it's on that principle, Cabinet Secretary, that there are some issues about a lack of transparency. So I'd quite like to ask, in terms of the Scottish Government's reaction to the possibility of a finance bill in this Parliament, and I know that would be a matter for the Parliament to decide. Does the Scottish Government have a view about the potential importance of a finance bill which not only would put a legal basis onto the government's tax and spend priorities, but would allow the Parliament to be able to scrutinise that and take that through as a bill, as it would do in the normal context of taking a bill through? Is the government open to that?
So, before I come on to that, let me just say something further about your previous question. I guess all of the advice in the round, whether it's from what the SFC were giving us, factual, the options then put through internal processes, and the work and advice of the advisory group, led us to make the decision that to give certainty for the remainder of this Parliament around any further changes to income tax. So the result of all of that was the decision that we went as far as we could. Now, others would really disagree with that, but that was the balanced view that came to in the light of all of that evidence. So hearing, that range of views, and that's where we as a government landed.
But just on that basis, what a finance bill would do would be to scrutinise the decisions which are placed in a budget by a Scottish Government on what tax and spend, and would allow the Parliament, rather than in committees, to be able to scrutinise the decisions that have been made, and therefore to make, I would have thought, great use of the data that has been presented to the Parliament.
So let me say, first of all, I mean, I don't have any in principle objection to a finance bill. I think it would just be a very different way of working. And it would, if it was, I guess it could be annual, but it wouldn't necessarily have to be. It could be a regular finance bill as opposed to annual. But I guess what we would need to think about is the undertaking, not just for government, but for Parliament, parliamentary procedure and process. I think we would need to just think through how that might work. I can see some of the advantages to it. I'm just kind of thinking through some of the standalone legislation. So we had the Scottish Aggregates Tax legislation, which shows that you can have the introduction of tax amendments requiring primary legislation, but others get made via secondary legislation. And whether or not you would have, you bring all of that together in an annual finance bill. Some years there wouldn't be much changing in terms of the elements of that. Other years may be more, more expansive, I guess, in a finance bill. So we'd have to think through. My answer generally is I'm not against it. I think it might be something that we could do some. It's just obviously that, I mean,
you've heard the criticism that's been levied that different committees of this Parliament, with this notable exception, tend not to scrutinise the budget in huge detail because of all the other work that they're doing. And therefore, as the convener said at the outset, that there's sometimes difficulty in understanding where various budget lines, particularly budget line 4, where that money is. Whereas if you have a finance bill, a Parliament is scrutinising in considerable detail the different stages, and that may help some of the issues that we've got about a lack of transparency.
Well, look, I think we should undertake to have further discussions about it. I've got no in principle objection. I do take the point that the engagement we had with the committee's debate was maybe lacking in some interest, so we need to reflect on that. We shouldn't just ignore it. It would take some time, though, I think, to put in process a very different set of arrangements for a finance bill. So I think we should may take that away and have some further discussion about what the implications would be, not just for government but for Parliament and parliamentary time. But happy to do that.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
I think you should rescind your retirement in order to progress it in the next session. Okay, John, to be followed by Craig.
Thanks very much, Convener. We're all very keen on multi-year, long-term plans and settlements and all the rest of it. Third sector wants them. SFC is looking 50 years ahead. But I mean, here we are 22 days before the UK spending review, and you appear to, and none of us have any idea really what's going to be in it. Is there any point us all looking ahead, further ahead, when we're so dependent on Westminster?
I think there is, in that if we can get into a regular cycle, which is, as credit where it's due, is one of the most important changes that the UK government have made in terms of that cycle of 3 years resource, 4 years capital. Yep, just gives an ability to have a line of sight of what the envelopes are beyond year to year. And why that matters is that having that would in turn enable me to be able to discuss with local government potentially multi-year settlements or other parts of the public sector that have difficulty with year-to-year budgeting. Third sector is another example. So if we were able to be able to give that line of sight over particularly 3 years resource, but also capital, it does help. Now, I'll caveat all of that by saying what that then amounts to in terms of the actual envelopes is very much dictated by those discussions that are going to be taking place and are taking place with Whitehall departments as we speak. And that will determine, essentially, by and large, what the bulk of the funding is for devolved administrations.
I have to admire your optimism. I mean, so the UK said they're going to do these every 3 or 4 years. I mean, but we've no way of knowing. I mean, they're not bound in any kind of way. They can just change their mind. I mean, they were meant to be having an election every 5 years. They dropped that. So, I mean,
that's true, but I think there's probably advantages for them. When you think about the end of the spending review period will be 28-29. Well, you can see why that might be of some advantage to a sitting UK government in terms of the election cycle. So I just think on principle, leaving aside some of the cynicism, which I totally understand why you have it, that it is a good idea to have that cycle of spending outlook.
Yeah. I mean, I agree it's a good idea. Yeah, we'll see if it happens or not.
To be seen, yes.
I mean, you're going to have 14 days between the 11th and the 25th of June. That's not very long, and presumably things have to get printed and all that kind of stuff. Will you be able to do all that work in 14 days?
Well, it is a challenge, and the teams know that that's a challenge, but they stand ready to get, once they have the envelopes, to rapidly run the numbers through to make sure we can produce that information for the 25th. I just think we were, the only other option would have been to have gone to September, and I felt I would be, given the committee's very strong views, I think that would have been even more challenging. So I'm keen to get that information out. So yeah, it will require a big effort, but there are some pillars, obviously, of the work that's going on around the delivery plan and parts of the MTFS that are being constructed in now, but the figures in terms of the spending outlook will be what will be slotted in.
Okay, thank you. The subject of public participation and involvement in the budget keeps coming up, and we've had that from various witnesses. And I mean, a lot of the public just seem to feel, well, let's cut taxes and increase public expenditure, which some of us don't think works. Do you think there's space? Have you any? As I said, you're an optimistic kind of person. Can we somehow, as a parliament, as the government, engage the public more in understanding how the finances go?
I think so, and this is one of the areas that was quite a live discussion at the tax advisory group, because actually some of the research shows quite a low understanding of the different systems, the fact that we have devolved taxes, that we have the income tax is devolved. Not everybody knows that. And when it's not unique to Scotland, I think people's understanding of the tax system generally is probably quite low, but we do have a more complex system here. We have commissioned external research by Ernst & Young on international best practice in tax communications, and we're going to be publishing that towards the end, around the end of May. And that's helped to inform things like tax literacy, because we do know that the higher the tax literacy, the better compliance level. So if people understand tax and are bought into the system, if you like, the better levels of compliance. So we will want to continue to look at how we can raise awareness, and we're looking at your Scotland, Your Finances is quite a good explainer, but we want that to reach a wider audience. So more work to be done. We want to, it might not be everybody's bag, but we're hoping to have the first tax conference in the autumn of this year. Now, we don't want that just to be the kind of great and the good and tax experts and everybody that likes to talk about tax. I know so we're quite thoughtful about how do we have more public involvement in that and make it a more dynamic event rather than something quite dry and just for those who are part of that field. So we're putting some thought to that and the overall kind of structure of how we might.
Do you think the schools should be doing more?
Well, I think there's something about financial literacy generally. I think it's important that schools, young people have that financial literacy, not just around tax, but around some basic protections given the level of scams and vulnerability that people, in the digital world have of and being aware. I think it's really important that young people have those tools to be able to understand and navigate through what is quite a complex system, but also some of the risks that are around. So I think anything that can be done to improve that would be good.
And what about MSPs? Do you think half of them are clued up in the finances?
Oh, I couldn't possibly. I would hope so.
I mean,
I would be disappointed if
Liz
they weren't.
Smith was very kind. She said they tend not to scrutinise the budget because they're too busy, or words to that effect. But I mean, we sometimes feel, and I suppose it is, I've got a slightly serious side to it, that the other committees in Parliament leave the financial stuff to this committee.
Yeah.
And I mean, a number of us have experienced being on other committees where, if we didn't raise finance, it seems that nobody would. Is that just inevitable, or again, should we be?
Well, it goes back to the exchange with Liz Smith. I think we were all, taking note of the lack of engagement, and it felt very kind of perfunctory. And I don't think any of us. I think we can all want something better than that. So the question is, what might work better? There's maybe a common cause there to make some improvements. Now, the finance bill might be one route forward through that, but there may be others, and I think we should have that further discussion.
And mentioning the committees, some of them, I think, wonder if when they do a bit of pre-budget scrutiny and report back, does that really have an impact on the government? Although linked to that, there's also the idea, well, committees are looking at financial things or should be looking at financial things all through the year. So presumably, would that have an impact? Can you say anything about the impact that you feel the committees are giving back to the government?
I mean, we take a lot of careful notice, obviously, of every committee report, what they're saying, issues that they've raised, and try to answer and queries, try to reflect some of that opinion in how we might improve things from the government's end. I mean, I do think there is a point about the ongoing level of engagement around budgets through the year, and whether or not there's more we can do to support committees in doing that. I don't know. I mean, some committees will be more. There'll be more of a focus, I guess, on some of the large spending areas. But sometimes some of the issues that become quite public can be quite small areas of spend that become quite controversial. There was obviously quite a lot of interest when we had to do the emergency budget. And that was elevated then into an area of quite a lot of public and committee and parliamentary interest. But on the ongoing kind of routine scrutiny of the budget and probably less so. But and if there's things
one example would at the moment be the Education Committee looking at Dundee University, and that's obviously got big. Well, it's mainly a financial issue.
Yeah,
there's probably other issues as well. But so that's not specifically linked to the budget, but it is a budget kind of thing, finance kind of thing. It brings in the questions about how universities are funded.
Yeah.
So would the government be taking notice of that kind of inquiry?
Yeah, of course, and it's a very high-profile inquiry. And yes, of course, we would very much so.
Okay. And just a couple of other things. Well, a pre-budget statement has been suggested by some witnesses. Now, part of me feels that's yet another, more information coming out. Do we really need that? But I suppose the argument is that it would set out maybe a kind of broader plan before you've finalised your budget plans. Any thoughts on that?
I'm just trying to think through what would it contain that would... it would have to be fairly general in nature, wouldn't it? Because otherwise you're essentially just doing the same thing in twice, and I'm not sure that would be the best use of time. I think if there are big changes, so if something happens that is going to have a major impact, then I think it is important to try and bring that to the attention of Parliament. So, and I'm very, I would always try to do that if there's something that is going to have an in-year impact, and we've done that previously.
Okay, and I think the final point I was going to make, the convener mentioned pay policy before. Now, there was criticism before that you hadn't spelt out your pay policy this year. You did, and if from memory, it's 9% for 3 years or 3% for 1 year. But then the NHS have quickly settled, I think, for 4 1/4 plus 3 3/4. So where are we going with this? Because it seems that almost it sets a basis, and then people negotiate beyond that.
So one of the things the pay policy was attempting to do, and we can have a debate about how successful it's been, was to really push the idea of multi-year pay settlements. And actually, in that respect, it's been quite successful in that we have significantly moved away from single-year deals, from the deals that have been done. So you take ScotRail, it's 6.6% over 2 years. I'm not sure we would have got there if we hadn't set the expectations of single years are going to be fixed. If you want beyond 3%, it's got to be multi-year. So in that respect, we've managed to really push. Now, Agenda for Change is, in my view, a ceiling and should be seen as a ceiling, not a floor. Previous years, that has nobody gets paid more than the nurses, I guess, has been the Now, we have ongoing dialogue with local government around the expectations and making sure that we get to fair settlements, but also settlements that recognise they have to be affordable as well as fair. And again, in the local government space, there are discussions around a multi-year deal, and I think that is helpful, because if we can get to a position where there is some kind of outbreak of peace for a couple of years, where everybody from the union side as well, who have consumed with the enormous task of annual pay negotiations, if we can buy a bit of time to be spent elsewhere, we can get into areas, for example, of reform, some areas of terms and conditions that unions, are, in particular workforces, are keen to focus on, looking at some of the areas that we could use those 2 years to make some progress on.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Craig?
Thank you. Good
Morning.
I've got a number of questions. Some of which relate to some that have come before, so we'll probably just dance around a little bit. Just in respect of financial literacy within schools, a written answer that I received yesterday in response to a question related to a Bank of England pilot project that's taking place in England, but which could equally apply in Scotland, in relation to increasing the uptake of economics within schools, reveals that within Scottish schools there's only 12 schools presently offering or where there's an uptake of economics at Nat 5. At higher, it's 37, and at advanced higher, only 5 schools. Now, that could be in part because there's no demand there, but is that Bank of England programme something that you might be keen to join to make sure that people do leave school with a financial literacy that perhaps gives them a greater understanding of tax and spending as they move forward in life?
Oh, I'll certainly look at that programme in more detail. I'm always keen to look at ideas, new initiatives, and if that is something that's working elsewhere, then I'd be keen to look at that. So we'll follow that up.
Just in terms of the work that you said that's been done in respect of trying to get greater understanding of the tax system, because that then leads to greater compliance. Another way of achieving greater compliance is to simplify the tax system. Is that something that you've taken advice on externally from either the Tax Advisory Group or from any management consultancy?
So the issue of simplification and making sure that people can understand the tax system, understand what's devolved, reserved and the different bands. So that issue was discussed on more than one occasion at the Tax Advisory Group. I mean, we do have a different band system, obviously, here in Scotland. I would argue strongly it's more progressive, but it is more complex, accept that. So even more important that people are made aware of the fact it's a different system, and how to raise awareness, and which, as I said earlier, is likely to ensure closer compliance. So,
in response to Mr Marra, I think probably Mr Marra tested the convener's patience in relation to his line of questioning, so I won't seek to do so particularly, convener. But in respect of it, in the letter that you sent to the Scottish Affairs Committee, you asserted very clearly that full control over spending and tax, so full fiscal autonomy, and I quote, you said, would create a fairer system that would protect public services and allow investment in our economy. What's your evidence from that? Who did you commission that evidence from that allows you to make that statement on the public record?
Well, look, there's no secret that, I, along with my government colleagues, believe that Scotland would be better served from being able to make decisions here on all aspects, because we would have levers that we don't have currently control of, and we would be able to make decisions that currently we don't. So, it's from a point of principle, and we have had the position of over a decade of short of independence. That is what we would pursue, and again, going back to incremental gains, one of the reasons that I was keen for a more fundamental review of the fiscal framework was to recognise the limitations. So our inability to respond in a way we would want to headwinds and events, whether it's a global pandemic or war in Europe. You know, we're very, very constrained through the current fiscal framework. My assertion and government's assertion is that we'd be better served by having a full range of fiscal levers at our disposal. Now, the point I was making to Michael Mara was the detail of what that would look like would be the work we would do as part of a review of the fiscal framework, and that's a door that's not open at the moment.
I just do think, just by way of a comment, I think in terms of, when you're talking about potentially £9 billion black hole, I think the assertion doesn't put food on the table potentially here, and you would want to do that work before you make that assertion, surely. But
none of that takes account of the use of levers. All of that is predicated on the current constitutional arrangements. That's the position of GERS, is essentially a kind of failure of the current system, rather than looking at what a different system and having those levers and how those levers are used. So, you know, we can debate this, you know.
It's probably for another place, but yeah. So just turning away from tax to spending, obviously public sector reform is going to be fundamental to future public spending proposals. In your letter to the committee, you say that the public sector reform programme and strategy will be published in June. Can you say when in June? Will it be alongside the medium-term fiscal strategy before or afterwards?
So that is with Minister for Parliamentary Business, and then it would obviously have to go to Bureau. So I think I would, you know, wait until that is agreed with the Bureau in terms of the specific date. But you know, it will be important to for that to be able to be set out in terms of the level of detail, which will then have a very clear direction and link to the elements in MTFS and the sustainability plan. It will be a key pillar of that.
Because presumably if it's going to be as bold and ambitious as I think it needs to be, given the current situation in the Scottish Government's budget, it is going to be very material to MFTS.
Of course,
it's going to be fundamental
yes, it will.
That.
It will be very material to.
Fine. And just in terms of more recent issues, it has emerged just over the weekend, obviously, that you're wanting to get civil servants back into work. It is equally reported the weekend, somewhat regrettably, that at present, you know, the number is so high you can't quantify how many civil servants are seeking to watch Netflix from their machines, and some are suffering for pornography. But culturally, in terms of the public sector reform programme, how ambitious are you going to be to get the civil service back to work, or wherever they're working, to make sure they're more productive, which seems to be the gap in terms of the additional investment that you put into the civil service hasn't been met because of by a commensurate increase in productivity, perhaps because they're up to things they shouldn't be.
Well, first of all, let me say that, like any other workplace, viewing inappropriate material is a disciplinary matter, and quite rightly should be a disciplinary matter.
Would you sack those civil servants if they were identified?
I am not in the position to be sacking anyone. That's not what ministers do. But I would expect that line managers and the proper disciplinary procedures, as all laid down, would be enacted if someone was viewing material during work time on work devices that they should not be doing now. And I think that would be the case in any workplace. In terms of the productivity point, I think there is a point. I don't take the assumption that you can only be productive if you're in the office. I think staff can be productive wherever they're working, as long as they are, managed in a way that is appropriate and they are meeting the goals set by their line managers. And I do think that we just have to be careful that some of the progress that's been made and more flexible working patterns, particularly for those who've got caring responsibilities, that we don't see that as a negative. I don't see it as a negative. What we need to make sure, though, is that that element of being part of a team and getting to know your colleagues is also important. So that balance of being in the office at an appropriate level to be able to do that while making sure that productivity levels are upheld. And that's, I think, the balance that the Permanent Secretary is seeking to achieve by the guidance that was sent out to staff a couple of weeks ago. That is the position that he will expect staff to adhere to. And I think that strikes the right balance.
And just in terms of, you talked earlier about making sure that targeted outcomes are driven by your spending choices. It's equally emerged recently that the total cost of government spin doctors has reached £100 million over 3 years. Is this the kind of government and associated departmental expenditures, including health boards? I can see that. Is that, again, as part of your public sector reform programme, before you would allow such a significant increase as that in future, would you better tie that expenditure to a public service outcome target? And what could the public service outcome target be for such a significant increase in expenditure on spin doctors rather than doctors, for example?
Well, I think when you use the term spin doctors, I think that that was looking at the entire communication staff across every organisation. I think, if I'm right, I'll write back to the committee, but there's no way. When I look at the special advisors, they take up a couple of desks in the office on the 4th floor. The idea that, there's this army of, hundreds of them, is just not the case. I think what it captured was every communication officer in every public body in every part of the public sector, every NHS board, local government as well, probably, to get to a big figure. Now, if your question to me is, what is the value? Well, I think it's really important that communication happens from our public organisations, not least the NHS, other public organisations. They've got to have an effective way of communicating, and that's what the people concerned are tasked to do. What we will, without getting too far ahead of ourselves in terms of what will be set out in terms of workforce and public sector, there is always a challenge of making sure that we are able to sustain our public services and prioritise and make sure our frontline public services are sustainable. That will inevitably mean changes to how things are delivered. The use of technology and digital will help us in ambitions to do that. But some of the support functions, I think, will look different over the next few years, and that will all be set out in due course as part of the plans that we're setting out.
Finally, and just briefly, just back to the convener's question in relation to these large in-year transfers, just to maybe try and close this one down, because we know that a number of stakeholder bodies have come to us and said that they would like this to happen, it should happen, it happens elsewhere. Are you saying it's impractical, undesirable or impossible? Which is it? No,
I'm not saying any of those things. I just set out the reasons that that sometimes there's a delicate balance of policy and the spend for the number of police officers or teachers, but the delivery sits over here. And it's about making sure that if we make any changes to that the policy coherence is still there. I think the point the convener made earlier was, well, there are some areas of spend that are quite stable and remain the same. So there's maybe a distinction to be made between those areas compared to some more fluctuating policy and delivery areas where that would be maybe more tricky. So I'm not against looking at that, and I don't want you to get the impression I am. I'm just setting out that there are sometimes good reasons for those in-year transfers to happen the way they do, but I'm very happy to look at it.
Okay, thanks.
Michelle.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for joining. I've just got a couple of wee questions because most areas have been covered. The first one was, I was out in Alberta recently visiting the Legislative Assembly there, and just for your information, all oil and gas receipts accrue to their balance sheet, and they have no limitations whatsoever on borrowing powers. So maybe it's a matter of perhaps education for members in this Parliament, perhaps even this committee, as to why that would be a good thing. But seriously, there's a general lack of ignorance in this Parliament as to the considerably higher proportion of powers and what is critically able to be done with those powers, particularly when you think about capital borrowing provisioning, of how the Scottish Parliament compares to other areas and jurisdictions. Do you think that might be helpful for people to understand a bit more about that? Because arguably, and I don't want to go off topic and get a row from the convener, but it's powers for a purpose, and those purpose must surely be about growing the economy.
Oh, absolutely. I think we sometimes need to maybe just raise the horizons, and this debate sometimes feels a little bit sterile of, well, the GERS figures, and rather than, well, actually, is there what is the evidence of what other jurisdictions have been able to do, short of independence? In some cases, you've cited one where I don't think it would be, I don't think that the people in Alberta would be, hankering after having those powers removed. So we do need to have a debate that just gets beyond some of those sterile debates into what would a sensible set of arrangements be that would give us the ability to grow the economy clearly, but also to be able to manage some of those headwinds. So our very, very limited borrowing powers don't enable us to do that, and that gets us into difficulty where we're having to rely on the UK government of whatever colour to be able to negotiate something around the global pandemic, the impact of that, which was an exceptional event. And we want to be able to mature our powers and levers to a position of being able to do more of that ourselves. I don't think that's a terribly controversial thing to say. Now, where it gets into the principles to the details is where it would then require a lot of negotiation with the UK government, and that would have to be done in good faith. But that door isn't open at the moment.
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, obviously, this session this morning has been about the Scottish budget process in practice. And you've alluded to in your earlier remarks about the inefficiency of the process. And I don't know anybody, whether it's the Fiscal Commission, if you were going to adopt a process, you certainly wouldn't start from here. But what always interests me is, given those inefficiencies, how we are able to collect the cost of those. So I imagine, you said earlier about the devolved institutions not being accorded the same respect as other departments, Whitehall departments, in terms of projecting the UK spending review. What that means, I think, is that you're going to have to make some assumptions. You're going to have to put the time and effort into doing those, and then presumably have to redo them when you get perhaps told later on. To what extent are you able to, or do you indeed kind of collect the costs of this inefficiency in process, or are you just continually responding to it? Because I think they could be quite illuminating if we're focusing on, we all know we've got quite a difficult crisis with public sector funding generally.
We don't collect the costs in that way, but there's clearly an inefficiency of having to go backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards trying to extract information. I think the protocol was probably a bit of an attempt to streamline and have an agreement that could help to move that forward. And we're pleased that we've got that, but it's then the custom and practice of you would have thought that a good way would have been for the same time, effort and priority being given to a sit-down negotiation with each of the devolved administrations, rather than we're going to negotiate and spend all that time with Whitehall departments. Your budget will be set by what the fallout from that is.
Yeah, and that's inefficient.
That's inefficient. One other thing that's inefficient is one of the offers we made was to work with the UK government around some of the economic opportunities. So my point I made at the meeting, it wasn't a FISC, was if we aligned our economic energies and efforts and sometimes funding in facing in the same direction, we could get a lot more out of that. So, for example, the status of SNIB, being able to access National Wealth Fund rather than being recipients of decisions made elsewhere. How could we align and actually try to agree to get more bang for the bucks of the investments that are being made in all of that? And that was our offer. And Acorn is a good example of that. We've offered to increase the funding to help try to push UK Government down the road of approval of Acorn, and remains to be seen whether that happens at the spending review. There is an inefficiency in not aligning and facing those investments and strategies and leverage that we have as governments. We should be trying to face those in similar direction.
Particularly if there's a shared endeavour around going for economic growth post-Brexit.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just one question to finish off from me, and that's basically about the Scottish National Investment Bank, which Audit Scotland recently produced a report on, and it actually praised the bank. It said that it generated income of in excess of its operating costs. It's well run, rigorous process for investing public funds. It said it's invested some £785 million. And it's got a return of £1.4 billion in private investment sector funding leveraged into that. But what Audit Scotland have said is that the Scottish National Investment Bank will not end its reliance on public funding unless ministers convince the UK Treasury to change its rules, which mean the bank is unable to keep financial returns and reuse them for future investments. And Audit Scotland going to say there's a lack of flexibility around the bank's budget because of the barriers presented by UK Treasury rules. So the question I'm asking is, have the ministers taken action to address this with the Treasury, and if so, what response have you received so far?
So these are issues that we have raised with the Treasury to try and find solutions. Additional budget flexibility could also assist in managing SNIB's financial position. We were keen for SNIB to be given the same status of as the National Wealth Fund, public sector financial institutions, which would enable SNIB to have more flexibility. So I think the latest from Treasury is that they haven't closed the door on that. Alistair, is that?
They haven't closed the door. They're prepared to engage with us, recognising that there's a need to ensure equity of treatment and that these fiscal powers and responsibilities are properly taken forward in Scotland. So there's conversations with SNIB, there's conversations with us. We're engaged with Treasury on that.
Okay, so that's something we should maybe revisit.
We'll keep you informed of any substantial developments.
Thank you for that. Well, thank you very much for your evidence today. I just wonder if there's any further points you want to make before we wind up the session.
I don't think so, Convener. Thanks to the committee. Oh, sorry. I'm chairing a meeting of the Tax Advisory Group in late August. I've just
right, okay, great stuff. Hope it doesn't clash with our away day on 26th, 27th of August, but there you go.
Thank you.
We'll certainly be asking you about that then in the not-too-distant future. We'll now consider, as a committee, the evidence received and publish a report on the Scottish Budget and Practice next month. We'll now take a 5-minute break to allow for a changeover of witnesses. Thank you. The next item on our agenda today is to evidence on the cost effectiveness of Scottish public inquiries. And I'm pleased that we are being joined by Ross Greer, who had the difficult job of being in two places at once this morning, but it's great that he's with us for this session. This is our first evidence session on inquiry, and as stated, our aim is to foster greater understanding of the current position with public inquiries in Scotland, enhance clarity around the purpose, framework and decision-making process for establishing public inquiries and their terms of reference, and ascertain if public inquiries deliver value for money. We will also look to identify any examples of good practice or alternatives to the current model. However, we will not make recommendations on the merits or otherwise of individual Scottish Government decisions on whether to hold a specific public inquiry or recommendations made by individual public inquiries. For this session, I'm delighted to welcome to the meeting Professor Sandy Cameron, CBE. Professor Cameron, we have your fascinating and thought-provoking written submission, so we'll move straight to questions. And I have to say, your submission is a bit of a showstopper. It's short, sharp and certainly to the point, so let's get into it. One of the things that you've said is that in terms of inquiries, you can confidently predict that they will last longer than anticipated and cost more than budgeted for. Why do you feel that this is the case, that they always seem to overrun both in cost and time?
I think that's based on the evidence that you've had in your papers in terms of inquiries that have been set up and how long they have taken to run, and in the budget. And when I was asked before the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry began to do some preparation with colleagues in the Scottish Government, that was one of the things I said, was that you think you can be almost certain that the inquiry will last longer than you think it's going to last, and it will cost more than you think it's going to last. Why that is the case? Perhaps because we don't have a mechanism for striking a balance between ensuring the independence of inquiries, but equally putting a focus on how our costs to be contained and constrained.
Yes, I mean, one of the things you've actually said, in terms of the Jersey inquiry, which you were directly involved in, the cost was estimated at some 6 months, and at the end it sat for, it was supposed to last 6 months and cost £6 million, and it actually cost £23 million in 2 years, so 4 times longer and 4 times more expensive. And what you went on to say is the cost levels in many ways also result of difficulty in managing the legal costs and holding the solicitors to the inquiry to the budget. So to what extent do you feel legal representatives are motivated to keep the cost to a minimum within budget?
I think the way that legal colleagues work is very much on the basis of doing what they believe they need to do, rather than looking at how do they contain cost and managing costs. So the expectation is this needs to be done, we will do it, and we will keep going and doing that. And a reluctance really to look at other ways that we might have done it, other ways that we could have contained costs, because to some extent this is about the way that we always practice. And I think one of the questions that I would have is, can we find alternative ways of doing this that would manage the costs more effectively and deliver more rapidly for people? Because one of the problems, I think, is when you have inquiries that last for a very long time, then the public lose interest in them. They lose sight of the inquiry. Particularly for inquiries with victims or survivors involved in them, then there is the issue of how long it feels for them that this is taking to get to a conclusion. So you look at the inquiries, Jersey was long at 2 years, but other inquiries have taken much longer than that and are continuing to take longer than that.
I mean, a number of things there in your answer. I mean, first of all, in terms of motivation, are firms actually motivated to actually limit costs? Because it seems to be that it's almost... there seems to be no real incentive for them to actually do so.
I don't think there is an incentive for costs to be limited. I think it's set up in that quasi-judicial way with firms there to do, and they do a very good job in many cases. They have expertise and what have you. But the focus is not on how are we going to contain the costs of this. It's, if it has to be done, it has to be done, and that's the cost. So there are models about other ways that elements of the inquiries could be undertaken by people who might not be so costly to do them? What would the options be there? And how can the cost be constrained?
I mean, I think independence is fundamental. So is justice not only being done, but being seen to be done. But is justice done if an inquiry takes 5, 10, 15 years? I mean, some of the survivors of an instance may not actually still be alive after 5 or 10 or 15 years. And so one wonders whether the frustration of waiting to see justice delivered, perhaps has a very deleterious effect upon them.
I'm sure it does. I think people have often waited a long time for their day, for the inquiry to be set up. Once it's set up, they, I think, have high expectations that this is going to resolve issues for them. They want their voice to be heard, and that's important. But if that then goes on for a long time beyond that, then I think it may well kind of simply add to the kind of sense of we're not being heard or understood. It's got lost sight of. And as you say, there is the risk, particularly where you're talking about inquiries into quite historic issues, as was the case in Jersey, then you're talking about a population of witnesses who may be quite elderly, quite frail, and who are not going to see the end of the inquiry. So I think that is an issue for us when we're dealing with inquiries, about how can we make them kind of sharply focused to get to the point for people, so that they don't drag on forever.
Yeah, I mean, the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry has already cost over £95 million and been going for 9 or 10 years. So, I mean, that's clearly an issue of concern. Now, yeah, you have actually made some suggestions, for example, in terms of something which could be an alternative. I should say, of course, that people who demand inquiries are looking for a judge-led inquiry often because they say it is the gold standard. What you've said, though, in your evidence is that witnesses, either individual or in small groups, when meeting around a small table with a panel to give their evidence, where lawyers are not involved, it's much less formal, less intimidating, but nonetheless added considerably to the information the panel was able to take into account. So that is, in your view, probably a more expeditious, less expensive, and probably for the people giving evidence, less kind of daunting prospect.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the Scottish Inquiry is now nearly 10 years, and I don't know that there's any kind of sign of it coming to an end. So there is a bit, how long does that go on for? What we had in Jersey was the opportunity to try out a different way of dealing with gathering evidence. A substantial part of the inquiry was in the fairly traditional format, with statements having been taken, counsel to the inquiry, questioning witnesses, the panel questioning witnesses in a quasi-courtroom setting. For the final part of the inquiry, however, we tried out, and our view was that it worked, having a meeting in a much smaller room, round a table, a bit smaller than this, but in many ways similar to what you're doing here. We're having a conversation about this with people, not necessarily just on their own, but sometimes in smaller groups, to have an opportunity for a conversation about their views, about their experience, about what they thought. And we did that in public, with the public being able to kind of sit round the table, behind the table, so that it was still in a public environment, but it was quite close and it felt quite intimate, and people felt quite comfortable with having the conversations that they did. And we were able to gather the information that way without, if you like, the panoply of all the legal process and the statements and the way that the courtroom setting works.
I mean, also, when inquiries have completed their deliberations, I think one area of frustration is, of course, that the report can take donkey's years to write. I mean, what you've said is that, that you tried in your report, which still took a year, that you agreed that we'd try to make it as short as possible in terms of the number of recommendations, and therefore there were 8. So are you suggesting that when inquiries are made, I mean, some inquiries have as many as 86, some have only had 1 recommendation, that they should try to make those recommendations, as, for want of a better word, as punchy and as kind of impactful as possible?
Yes, I see some inquiries, the reports run to several volumes, and you kind of think, well, there's a question of who's going to read that. Yeah. What happens with it? In Jersey, the volume of the report that came in 3 sections, one that kind of set out the basis of the inquiry. Then there was quite a large volume that basically contained the evidence that had been heard, and then a shorter final document that contained the findings and the recommendations. And we've determined that what we should do in that document is write it in clear terms, in simple terms, and be quite specific about the recommendations and why we were making the recommendations. But that they should be kept to as small a number as we could in terms of the things that we reached a conclusion would make a difference in that particular jurisdiction in terms of what had happened in the past. And we also made a final recommendation out with the 8 that the panel should go back in 2 years to look at progress against the recommendations. Because one of our concerns is that inquiries sit for a long time, they write voluminous reports, they make recommendations, and then what happens to the recommendations? What do we know about were those recommendations actually the right recommendations? Do we research that? Were they implemented? Were they implemented fully? What were the reasons for them not being there? Of course, inquiries make recommendations. Government or other parties may not accept those recommendations, but they need to be clear why they're not going to accept them and what that's about. So what we did in Jersey was we made that recommendation. That was accepted by the Chief Minister in Jersey, and we went back after 2 years. We met for 2 weeks. We visited a lot of people. We heard from a whole range of people about what their thoughts and views were, and then we produced speedily after that quite a short report on the progress that had been made or not been made. And in Jersey, some of the recommendations had been implemented or were in the process of being implemented. Some recommendations were still quite far away in terms of getting there. Now, one of the issues with that was that many of the victims and survivors, in particular, who had been concerned with this, asked if we would go back again in another 2 years. We took the view that we shouldn't do that because there had to be a point at which the states of Jersey took responsibility on its own and delivered that. But I suspect that we would have been very welcomed by them if we'd gone back after another 2 years and then maybe another 2 years. So there is that challenge in it. But I do think that there needs to be some process, some mechanism for following through on recommendations as part of identifying whether there was value for money in this inquiry.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was of great interest to me, the fact that you actually did follow through in terms of recommendations going back 2 years, because I think you're absolutely right. What we seem to see from some inquiries is years and years and years taking evidence. A report published, is then something published in the media, the government might make a statement in Parliament, and then that's it. You know, whether the recommendations are delivered or not and over what timescale is a real issue. So the government may say we will accept these recommendations, but then a year, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, there's not we will accept them and implement them by day X. I think is a real issue. And again, it goes back to justice for the people for whom the inquiry was set up in the first place. Because inquiries sometimes, as you'll be aware, will be set up sometimes by governments who think they're under pressure, you know, and they think this is a good way of kicking things into touch, perhaps. I would suggest. But I was quite amazed that you seem to be the only one that's actually followed through that kind of process, and that's really an issue that you know, jumped out from your statement. So did many other things. I mean, another thing that you pointed out was you said the first UK inquiry was held into the death of a foster child, Dennis O'Neill, 1945, chaired by Sir Walter Monckton, and It commenced in March, reported in May. The report was 15 pages long, and the recommendations you made have been repeated in every child care inquiry since then. And what you're basically saying is that, you know, what we'll have is a kind of reinvention of the wheel in terms of some of these inquiries, whereby recommendations made some 80 years ago, which would probably still have some validity now, have still not really been implemented.
Yes, I think often we hear from victims and from others that we need this inquiry so that lessons will be learned and this will never happen again. Sadly, when you look at the history of particularly child protection inquiries, child abuse inquiries, you find over and over again the same issues coming up about failure to do certain things, failure of communication, not looking deeply enough at issues. So those factors come up over and over again. So it raises the question about how well do we actually learn the lessons from inquiries. And it is the case that some of the things that Monckton said, all that time ago in terms of a very early child protection inquiry. It was the death of a child in foster care that he was looking into, are still coming up over and over again. So I do think we need to think carefully about, do we actually learn the lessons, and is there a reason if we don't?
Yeah, yes, and I mean, and also we should be learning the lessons from other jurisdictions, one would think as well, because I mean, obviously these kind of issues happen in other places at other times, and one would have thought looking at what's actually happening elsewhere might be better than kind of starting afresh on every single occasion.
Well, I think a couple of things in that. I mean, I think in some jurisdictions there are differences. I understand that in Scandinavian countries there will be different processes that mean that things are dealt with differently and more speedily. I think when you look at the information in your background papers about the COVID inquiries, it's striking about what's happened in other jurisdictions in terms of how long their inquiry has taken and what it's caused by comparison with what's happening in the UK and in Scotland. So that raises questions about are our much more expensive inquiries more effective, or are other jurisdictions able to do these things equally effectively?
I mean, one of the things you talk about is in the Jersey inquiry, there were 2 solicitors required to involve considerable hourly rates. Now, in the Scottish COVID inquiry, senior counsel was capped at some £200 an hour, with around 40 hours a week, but possibly 60. That could effectively range for that individual from £8,000 to £12,000 a week. But so far, the Scottish COVID inquiry has cost £34 million and is still ongoing, and the UK one £164 million. So that's a lot of hours for lawyers, is it not?
It's a lot of hours. And in Jersey, because of that jurisdiction, and Jersey obviously is a small place, so it didn't have a whole lot of resource, we had to do quite a lot of the legwork at the start of the inquiry as the panel, and what Jersey sent that up as a panel was with a chair, Francis Oldham, QC, now KC, who was a very experienced barrister, and Alison Leslie, my colleague, and I sitting as the panel members. But we had to do a lot of the work to set this up. At that early stages, we had to appoint solicitors to the inquiry. We interviewed a number of companies, and part of that process was negotiating the fees down as low as we could, because we were aware of what these would amount to. Counsel is expensive. Counsel in Jersey was in the order of that £200 an hour that we were paying for senior counsel and junior counsel to the inquiry. And then once you're into it, what we were finding was that solicitors to the inquiry were saying, well, no, the statements need 2 people, one to be basically asking the questions and another one to be writing the basis of the statement that would then go put in place. So the statements then go backwards and forwards. So there's a lot of process goes on, all of which costs money, because all of it is being done on the basis of billable hours. Mm-hmm. So you're then into that dilemma of how do you control the billable hours? How do you say to a solicitor, you've spent too much time doing that, when they say, oh, but this is the time that it took, it needed to be done. So, and that's where you get into those difficult dilemmas about ensuring independence, ensuring it's been done properly, but equally saying, does it really need to be this way? Could we find other ways of doing it?
I mean, the Sheikh Bio report so far is £17 million, I believe, in legal fees alone, and even if it was £200 an hour, that'd be 85,000 hours.
Yes.
If it was for senior counsel, and they're not all senior counsel, so eyebrows certainly have been raised over the costs of these inquiries. And if we compare it elsewhere, Australia are not greatly different from the UK one we have thought in many areas. Their COVID inquiry took 13 months and cost £4 million. For example, New Zealand's is ongoing. It's been ongoing for 2 years, but it's 7 million so far, so it's a lot less in Scotland. And Norway and Sweden, Finland have all concluded theirs within about a year or so. So there are ways in which this can be done more efficiently and effectively. I mean, you talked about an inquisitorial approach, for example, but could there also be a more standardised approach to the practicalities in terms of start-up time and reduced costs? We've already heard about the Caldwell case. It's taken some 13 months after it was announced before it's been set up. So that's over a year. That family's had to wait day in, day out, wondering when that's going to happen. And we also are aware that the El Jamel case spent over £1 million before even any evidence has been heard.
Yes, I mean, I think there is a need to look at, could we set up some sort of structure, some sort of unit that could be the starting point for inquiries, so that everything was ready, so you didn't have to kind of reinvent the wheel for every inquiry with that. That was one of the considerations when the work that was led by my colleague in terms of working with the universities to look at expert views on this, Alison Leslie, was we had hoped that we might get to a point of being able to argue a case that a unit could be set up, perhaps in the university or elsewhere, that could form the basis of supporting inquiries, training people to do that, to get over that initial period of time. Because, as you say, that can take a long time to get underway. There's all the setting up. There are a lot of practicalities about premises, about document management systems, documents. Jersey had well over 1 million documents to deal with. Other inquiries will have much larger amounts. You've got the arrangements for transcription, lots of practical things that the public don't see that need to be put in place behind the scenes. Now, much of that, I think, could probably be standardised. You could have a kind of ready-made approach to it, but also part of it has to be what's the model going to be. The model that we've got of the judge-led inquiry, whilst we would say it is inquisitorial, the reality is that it tends to be adversarial, because that's the way that people in that environment work. Could we find an inquisitorial way that would be much more interrogative in terms of trying to find out what happened, and perhaps do that much more speedily with it. In terms of just going back to the issue about going back to review recommendations, one of the issues is that when the inquiry is finished, it no longer has status, but we were able to kind of get around that and say, well, irrespective of that in Jersey, we will go back. We don't need if you like, the powers to summons witnesses and documents. We're beyond that with it. So I think those kind of issues that get thrown up can be resolved. If we've got the will, we can resolve those issues and say, let's do it differently. Let's try things out differently and see if it works.
My degree was in economics. I love to read the phrase opportunity costs when I actually see a submission, the actual fact. And you've raised a really important point in terms of that. Because people see the cost. So the cost in Scotland, you know, has been 230 million in public inquiries, UK 1.5 billion. But that's only the kind of, you know, the above the surface kind of costs, if you like. Inquiries can be like an iceberg. You only see the bit above the surface. And you've talked about the hidden costs for participants, such as local authorities, redaction, preparing documents, also for participants in terms of finance, staff time. You're also talking about, you know, the emotional impact on people who are giving evidence, etc. And that is not just the victims or alleged victims, but also people who are, from a professional point of view, having to give evidence to that. We understand that in at least one of the inquiries that we've been looking at, the actual real costs, if you want to call it that, are double what the stated costs are because of these opportunity costs. And if that's got to come out of a particular public service like local government, that's not being spent on public services if the money's having to be redirected into the cost of an inquiry. So do you think there's a way in which these hidden costs can be brought more into the public domain so that people can see what the true impact of these inquiries is?
I think it would be important if inquiries reported on what the total costs were of everything that was involved in the inquiry. When I was doing the briefing and preparation for the Scottish inquiry, I also did some work with local authorities to say, you need to get ready for this. This is going to take you time. You will need to be looking at documents, files, historic files. You'll be needing to look at redaction for those. The services need to devote staff time to that. So there is a cost that goes on. And if the inquiry is going on for a long time, then that cost goes on in terms of a never-accruing cost to people. And the other aspect of the opportunity cost is, in terms of the total costs, what might we have done in relation to the issue that the inquiry is looking into? In Jersey, for instance, one of the things that at the start of the inquiry that I was doing was going round and meeting various organisations to tell them about the inquiry and what we were going to expect from them. And I was conscious at that time that at that point the inquiry was expected to cost £6 million. But I was meeting organisations in Jersey in the third sector who were having their budgets cut. So that felt, frankly, awkward for me as a former director of social work to be saying, yes, we're going to be having this inquiry, it's going to cost all this money to do it, it's important, we need to do it, but actually you're potentially having to shut down services. So there's that difficult balance, I think, to think through in terms of what the opportunity costs are.
I'm just going to ask one last question, because colleagues are keen, obviously, to come in, understandably. So, I mean, you've said basically that on that issue there's a need to examine ways in which cost inquiries can be contained without being seen to compromise independence. And you've said that could they be expected to work to set budgets and timetables as opposed to the somewhat open-ended arrangements which pertain at present and which too often result in escalating costs. But surely they should, absolutely, because I can't think of any other area of government where, for example, there's an open-ended timescale or budget. You know, I mean, you don't set a capital contract and just say, well, just take as long as you like, spend as much as you want. I mean, I know that's not said implicitly, but it's almost explicitly, almost implicitly, I should say. No one says that, but that's almost the way it appears to be if one looks at how inquiries are rolled out. I mean, for example, the Vale of Leaving inquiry, the Health Secretary at the time said, I'm looking for a report within 15 months, and the judge said, well, we'll do it as soon as possible, which turned out to be over 5 years. So do you believe that there should, in actual fact, be parameters in terms of cost and timescale like there is for any other area, for example, public sector?
I think you should certainly look at how could you set parameters and hold inquiries to account in terms of delivering to that. Now, that's not to say that you might say, we want this report by this time. And it may well be that issues have emerged, that there is a case to be made out about why it needs to be extended. But at least there would then be a reference back and a process for agreeing that there would be an extension of the timescale, rather than the current situation where they just go on for as long as they want to go on.
There's also an issue, of course, of a conflict of interest when legal firms that are directly involved in a specific inquiry are themselves suggesting perhaps a deepening and widening of that inquiry. Would you agree to that?
I think that's one of the challenges. I don't know that this happens consciously, but I do think there is a bit that says, what interest is there in legal firms kind of saying, let's do this more quickly, let's cut this down, let's quicker, as opposed to there's more, because you can always say there is more that we need to look at, let's look at this aspect. So I do think there needs to be a very clear kind of discipline focused on, we're not going to go down that route, we're dealing with what we're dealing with. Some of that needs to be, I think, embodied into the terms of reference at the outset, be quite clear about what it is that the inquiry is to look at, because inquiries can kind of diverge, grow arms and legs a bit, I think, into other areas, and that extends the timescale. And there are few people who are involved in it likely to be saying, can we cut this down? Can we slow this down?
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, it's whet the appetite of colleagues around the table. The first to ask questions will be Michelle, followed by John.
Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us. And I think I too was very intrigued by your submission, and I think it's worthwhile quoting one sentence that jumped out because it's quite compelling. It has to be recognised that inquiries are a source of substantial income for some large legal firms, and as such the question arises as to the extent to which they are motivated to keep costs to a minimum and within budget. I think that's a very, very powerful sentence. And I looked up your kind of background in readiness for this, and obviously you've got a very long and compelling hinterland. Is there any other arena that you've dealt with through the source of your career where there is no cost control whatsoever when we're dealing with millions of pounds? The terms of reference don't ordinarily contain budget. There's no stage gates, if you like, or phasing of the inquiry. There's no active monitoring. Have you ever come across that in any other walk of life in your career?
No, I haven't. I think this is something that you are aware of in terms of the legal processes, that this is how it works, and that once you embark into that, you've got no real way of knowing what the costs are going to be. That worries me in terms of it can be a reason not to engage in some of the legal process, because the worry about cost. But I think, particularly in terms of inquiries, then they are set up and then they become open-ended. One of the things that you might look at is when the Bloody Sunday inquiry went on. That went on for a very, very long time and cost a great deal of money. But it was said in that lawyers are expensive. They're very expensive. That was a quote from Lord Savile, who chaired that inquiry, who was very resistant to the idea that he should curtail the inquiry or stop it. But it was simply, that's the way it is. And if you want me to do the job, then that's what it will be.
Yeah. And in terms of going back to a comment that the convener made earlier, we've seen examples where lawyers acting on behalf of clients make the call for a public inquiry in the media, and it can be very sort of vigorous. Now, one can take a view that the lawyers are doing the right thing for their clients, or you could also take the view that they understand that the opening of a public inquiry then means that their costs are going to be covered by the government of the day. What are you aware of in terms of, and I know your experience was with Jersey, but are you aware of any checks and balances in that process at all, where people think, but wait a minute, if this action goes to a public inquiry, it's a licence in effect to print money. Were you subjected to checks and balances, or was it you yourself that was putting the checks and balances in place?
I think we were putting the checks and balances in place. We were very conscious that this was because of the experience of the other panel members, that this was something that could end up costing a lot of money. So we did our very best to try and constrain the costs. Arguably, we failed miserably in terms of the fact that the initial kind of figure that had been worked out by a firm of consultants in terms of what they thought would need to happen turned out to be far from the truth. And we had a very difficult process in having to say to the Chief Minister in Jersey, this is going to cost more. And basically you're in a corner now because you can't really say, no, we're not going to fund it. Having started, you can't say, well, wrong idea, let's pull back from that with it. So I think there is that bit. I think in terms of there are clearly lawyers in Scotland who are very important in terms of ensuring that people are properly represented, that their cases are heard. But underlying it all, there is a business aspect to it as well, I think. And we need to acknowledge and recognise that, particularly if we're thinking of, is there another way to do this? Because there will be resistance to other ways of doing it.
Yeah.
So I think we need to be alert to that fact in looking at, could we do inquiries differently so they would cost less and could be delivered more speedily.
Okay. And in terms of the inquiry you were dealing with, how much pressure were you coming under from government there to keep a lid on costs, or how much active monitoring was there from them? Or again, was that you pointing that out? You mentioned that you had to go back and say, look, costs are going to increase.
We were not put under pressure by the States of Jersey, in all fairness to them. We were having conversations with them about the costs. They were anxious about the costs, and we were doing our best to manage those with that. But I think, again, when it comes to that balance between pressure from government and the need for independence, because if you are seen to be pressured by government, then particularly in inquiries where there are victims, they will end up kind of feeling that justice has not been done. That this is just... and in Jersey there was a lot of suspicion. They had this thing that was often said in Jersey about the Jersey way, that believed there was a kind of conspiracy against people. So you had to be very clear, and the Chief Minister was very clear from the outset that nobody from Jersey had to be involved in the inquiry, so that it would be seen to be independent. So that was a real strength, but it highlights, I think, what some of the dilemmas can be.
And so presumably within that there was kind of active consideration of where potential of, say, conflict of interest might occur. What people say about Scotland, and I imagine it's similar in Jersey, is the good thing about Scotland is everybody knows everybody. The bad thing about Scotland is everybody knows everybody. But it sounds like that Jersey was very aware about the potential for conflict of interest where there was existing relationships that might be mutually beneficial.
Yes, and I think that was, they were very conscious that was the fact. Now, Jersey has a population of just over 100,000. It's 9 miles by 5 miles, so it's, people do know one another, and they do recognise one another. It's got very different structures of the way that things work. So it was absolutely right that the Chief Minister at the outset, in appointing the panel, who were all from outside Jersey, was very clear that he wanted nobody from Jersey to be involved in the running of the inquiry. We had a liaison person from the States of Jersey, but we... interestingly, after kind of the first week, one of the victim witnesses said, "What's he doing here?" With that, because they recognised who he was and what he did. And we made sure from then on that he was not kind of in the premises other than when he had to be. So it can be as sensitive as that. Scotland's much bigger, but in the arena of these inquiries, people will know one another.
It's about the principle.
Yes.
And you make comment in your submission about the further costs of redacting statements and allude to the fact that they're very expensive. I think it would be useful, given that we're just at the start of this inquiry, if you could set out why it is that they're so expensive. Is it simply about time and the concept of time online?
It's about time of going through documents and identifying what needs to be redacted in documents, because you obviously have to be sensitive to documents that are going to end up in the public domain, about what's in there that can't be included in it. So redaction is quite a long, slow process of going through, because you need to be sure that it's all been checked with that. Now, if that's being done by solicitors on hourly rates, then that's high. So the question arises, can other people do the redaction? Can they be trained to do the redaction? But it is an important element. You don't want information to get into the public domain that could present a hazard to somebody in there. So it's an important element of it. But it's not something that people, I think, tend to be familiar with as part of what goes on in an inquiry.
And, I mean, you've mentioned the term, and I think the convener did as well, in terms of the concept of billable hours. I mean, there really isn't any other kind of walk of life where you would go into something and it would be charged out on a billable hours basis without some attempt at negotiation of fixed costs up front, particularly where they're going to be significant. Is this just precedent because that's the way lawyers like to operate?
It's the way it works. I don't know. You'll need to ask lawyers now about that. I think maybe there is more pressure from clients these days to look for a fixed price. Can you do that? I think it would be very difficult probably to get that done in an inquiry. So I think the issue is really about the negotiation that you can get the rates down. We used the Treasury rates as the kind of baseline for that to get them down as low as they could with it. But it's a contentious issue.
Okay, and just got one last wee question. One of our people who gave evidence commented about the unintended impact of what was called the Maxwellisation process, where it referred to somebody in the report that they had the opportunity to have early sight and to seek modifications. To what extent do you think that ultimately could potentially affect be another one of the potential effects on outcome if somebody has the chance to
the Maxwellisation process, which is there as a safeguard for people who've given evidence, is important. But again, it's a process that can take quite a long time.
Therefore, money.
For that. I don't think it's something that should affect the findings or the recommendations. What it will do is potentially reflect what the evidence is that's summarised in the report.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. John, to be followed by Liz.
Thanks, Convener. And I'll maybe start by declaring an interest in that I'm a chartered accountant. So we also I think we do charge by hour, some of my colleagues. But I was going to draw the kind of comparison because a company's accounts have to be audited. And I think most people would say that, yes, auditors get it wrong at times, but they are independent. And yet the financial arrangements are very, very different. And I mean, there's a legal requirement that financial accounts are submitted, usually within 9 months or thereabouts, and they have to be audited. And I think in the case of banks, it's even quicker than that. So, I mean, coming from that background, maybe I'm biased, but, you know, do you think there's some scope in there, as there would be for an audit, which is still independent? Because you talked about this balance between independence and controls.
Yeah.
You know, is there some that the legal side of things could learn from the accountancy side of things?
I would have thought so. I would have thought if there's an audit process, it at least raises questions about why that expenditure was necessary. And I think expenditure should be justified in it, rather than simply this is the way we do it.
I mean, is it a different mindset? Because again, you said, if I got it correctly, if it has to be done, it has to be done. Whereas within the accountancy profession, you know you've got a month to do the very best you can. And I think that would apply to others. I mean, the cleaners in this building do the best they can in 8 hours. The cooks in the canteen do the best they can in a set amount of time. So it's a different kind of mindset. Is that, I mean, at times I just wonder, is that impossible to change?
I'm not sure how easy it is to change the way if you like, the legal profession work. I think the question then is, are there other ways that the inquiry might operate? Does it all need to be on that basis? Some of it may well need to be, but there may well be other ways that it can work in terms of people who do interviews, who do elements of the investigation that would cost less.
Yeah. And the idea that it's got to be judge chaired, and we seem to have got into this position that there's a kind of hierarchy. Yeah. And, you know, if it was a politician, well, that wouldn't be very good chairing it. But if it was if it's a judge, well, that's the gold standard, and therefore everyone wants that. I mean, it's a bit difficult to unwind that, isn't it?
Well, I think we've got now a kind of, if you like, public perception, a media perception that if there has been an issue, it should be an inquiry and it should be judge-led. So that said, I don't know there's an awful lot of thinking goes on behind why does it need to be a judge-led. And of course, it doesn't legally require to be led by a judge. And indeed, the inquiry, the UK inquiry into child sexual abuse, was chaired by Professor Alexis Jay, a social worker, with that. So it can be done by other people and bring a different perspective to it. I have worked alongside judges in the Parole Board and other places. I've got great respect for them, but they do operate in a particular way because that's where they've been trained, that's the environment that they operate in, and perhaps they are going to be less comfortable with saying, let's find another way of doing this with it. But I think we need to be really raising the question about why does every inquiry need to be judge-led. There's an opportunity cost in that in terms of the number of judges now in Scotland, or retired judges, who are tied up in inquiries going on for a long period of time.
So it might be, I mean, you in your case with Jersey, you were kind of expert in that field, yes, as I understand it, but you were from outside, obviously. Yeah. So presumably, well, I would have thought that there's quite an argument, if something's a very specialised area like medical, that there would be a strong argument for having a very medical person in charge rather than a legal person.
Yes, I mean, there's an argument for that, but who would be the best person for this terms of reference to chair this inquiry? What would they bring to it? I think the other element of it is the question of whether the Jersey model, as has happened with the ICSA in London, where there's somebody chairing it, but there's also a panel with different expertise in it. So in Jersey, the inquiry was chaired by Francis Oldham, KC, who also had experience sitting as a judge, but was a defence barrister in the main. But she had a panel of the other two of us who were both from a social work background. And we worked together, and in fact, when it came to questioning witnesses, probably the important role that we played was to question witnesses based on our experience and our expertise.
So that was 3 in the panel, is that correct? Was that did that in retrospect, was that good, or would 5 been better, or?
No, I think 3 was sufficient. It meant that we were able to work as a unit. If you add more and more people onto it, then I think you just kind of add complication to it. But it also meant that we had a group who we could if you like, divvy the work up between in terms of the day-to-day management of the inquiry and when it came to writing the report.
Mm-hmm. And, I mean, there's well, one of the points that's raised, I think, by somebody else is that, you know, there's different... people are hoping to get different things out of a public inquiry, but the victims or the families or the survivors or that kind of group are obviously key to the whole thing, and they're obviously the ones, often the ones that are demanding a public inquiry. Is your experience, or do you know, are they normally satisfied? I mean, Jersey would be an example. Are these people, on the whole, satisfied with the public inquiry when we get to the end of it?
I think the answer to that question is no, we don't know, and we should know. I think we need to do more in terms of asking people who have been victims or survivors, who have been witnesses, whether at the end of the day, did they feel that justice had been done, had their voice been heard. I think often people feel that if they have their day at the inquiry, that will bring closure for them. And unfortunately, quite often it doesn't bring closure. And in other cases, it brings back the issues that have been looked at. So there needs to be proper support for people who end up distressed as a result of giving evidence. So I think we don't know enough about that from them.
I mean, it sometimes seems to me that you see people on TV or wherever, and you know, you get the result of the inquiry, but they're very open that they're not satisfied with it. I mean, whether sometimes people are wanting revenge, they're wanting somebody's head to roll. And if that doesn't happen,
yes, and I think that's where to some extent you've got to be clear with people about what the inquiry is about, what's going to happen. I think victims and survivors want their voice to be heard, and they want to be believed. You can't say we're going to believe everything you say because we need to test that out. But essentially, they want to be in an environment where their voice is heard and they're believed. I think they want to understand what has gone wrong in the past. And there is undoubtedly an element where they want to arguably apportion blame, but perhaps more positively, they want to be able to attribute responsibility with that. And they need to feel that those objectives have been achieved for them. And I think we don't test out sufficiently regularly whether that has been achieved by people. In Jersey, an informal level, when we asked people after we published the report, the victims, the main kind of people who had been calling for the inquiry, indicated that they were satisfied, not least of all because we had made recommendations about things that they had not expected we would touch. In that environment, they thought they won't do that, and we did. Yes. And in many ways, that was important for people.
And I mean, maybe I should know that, but I mean, was blame part of the thing that you kind of concluded on, which, as you just said, some people are expecting, or is that vary amongst public inquiries? Some would attribute blame, and some wouldn't.
I think blame is. I think there's an issue about responsibility. I think in our report, we would have, and the evidence we would have said, and the questioning we would have said to people, why didn't you do this at the time? You know, so you need to hold people to account for the actions that they took, or the failures that they made with it, or why they behaved in particular ways. So I think it is important that you do that. I think it's not. I think sometimes there is a misconception for people that they would like to see prosecutions, and in the main, there's an agreement that there won't be prosecutions based on the evidence in the inquiry.
Yes. And I mean, I don't know what your knowledge is of other countries, but you know, we're hearing like from the Nordic countries doing it much simpler, quicker, and all of that. Have you any idea if the public there are satisfied with that? Or?
No, I don't, but I think that would be one of the things that would be worth finding out.
Yes.
About the perception of why have we got to this stage in Scotland and the UK where we have so many inquiries, so many expensive inquiries and such long inquiries.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. List will be followed by Craig.
Thank you, and Convener, just before I ask my questions, can I just put on the public record that I'm obviously very heavily involved in providing case notes to one of the inquiries, non-pecuniary obviously, which may be used in evidence as that inquiry progresses. Professor Cameron, can I just ask, when it comes to the decision about whether it is a judge-led inquiry or not, To what extent is the main deciding issue about compelling witnesses to appear? Because obviously that has been a concern for many of the victims who've been involved, that they are very keen indeed, rightly so in my opinion, to see specific witnesses compelled to give evidence.
I think that's a feature of it. I think that does not mean that it needs to be a judge who's chairing it. I think there needs to be certainly legal involvement in that process. But I think the power to compel witnesses and to compel documents in many inquiries is an important one, so that people feel that there's no escaping from.
And so do you think the reason for the demand for a judge-led public inquiry tends to be because people believe that that person will have the legal authority and legal standing to be able to get more out of the evidence? Do you think that's...
I think they may do. I think when they're calling for that, they're thinking that this will be like a court. It should be like a court. Whereas perhaps if we have a more inquisitorial model, it can be different kind of environment.
And just in relation to the comment you made in answer to Mr Mason, where you implied that the demand for public inquiries is growing, do you think that one of the reasons for that increase is because public services in the UK, not just in Scotland, are not delivering satisfactory answers when something goes wrong?
I think it's difficult to know why there is that growing demand. It's almost become the automatic response to an issue. Is we need an inquiry, we need a public inquiry, and then often that becomes we need a judge-led inquiry, without saying, yes, we need to find out what went wrong, but is there another way that we've got for doing that with it? And often because these things are happening quite long time after the event, then it comes back and it takes a long time to argue that corner. I think, yes, public authorities need to be open about issues that they've got wrong and be able to say that.
Yeah, I mean, my own personal view is a personal view, not just because of the inquiry with which I've been involved, but reading extensively about other ones, is that I have a feeling that victims do not feel that there is sufficient accountability within the public authorities. In other words, the reason why we've got a demand for public inquiries is because people are dissatisfied with the lack of accountability in their eyes of different public bodies. And that's a major issue. If that's correct, that is a major issue. And so I wonder, in terms of trying to ensure that there is better accountability, do you think that there should be more government input when it comes to ensuring that whistleblowing is effectively responded to, or should there be other structures within government that can hold some of the bodies to account?
I think it is important to hold bodies to account. And absolutely, I think for people who have been victims or survivors, if it's that type of inquiry, they need to feel that people, if they are still kind of in post, are held to account for the actions that they took. And I think that then is not for the inquiry itself, it's for the inquiry in terms of its report and what it says has gone wrong. It's then for those institutions to decide how they're going to deal with that. And that would be part, I think, of the follow-through.
Yeah, because I really do think this is quite a serious issue at the moment, and it's one of the reasons why we have an increasing demand for specific public inquiries. And actually, I think it's a reason why they are taking longer, because the toing and froing to try to get to the information that is required takes an awful long time, and the costs multiply. Yes. And it's partly the hidden costs as well.
Yes.
That takes such a long time. You're talking about redaction. That's vitally important in terms of data confidentiality, etc. But I think there is a real issue about the amount of time that it does take when, well, I think there's a frustration about that time, because some of the answers should have been provided before by some of the agencies who have been accused of lack of accountability and taking responsibility. I think that's a major issue. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts as to what we can do to try to improve that.
I think, looking back in my career as a director of social work, my approach was always, if something had gone wrong, we'll deal with it straight away. Sometimes colleagues in other places thought, well, we'll wait until there's an inquiry. My view was that it was better that we had dealt with it kind of internally, taken whatever action was necessary, so that if it came to an inquiry, we were in a position to say, that's been addressed, here's what we did, we found it. So I think there is that bit of process about not letting things sit, but actually being seen to deal with them, and to deal with them openly.
And my last question, in general terms, I don't mean this about any specific inquiry, but do you think there has been an increasing temptation for government, any government, not any particular political colour, to accept a public inquiry because it gets them out of the responsibility of taking decisions that perhaps they should have been?
I think that is certainly the suspicion of many people, is it feels like, as an inquiry, a way of, as I think you, Chairman, said, kicking it into the long grass. Because once the inquiry has been announced, it allows, whether it be in central or local government or wherever, people to say, I can't say anything about this because it's the subject of an inquiry. But then if that inquiry goes on for years, then it kind of moves it away altogether. So it's that bit about how do you kind of keep to the moment.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Craig, to be followed by Michael.
Good morning, Professor Cameron. Thank you for joining us. Just looking back to the use of Royal Commissions in the past, in the 1970s, I think I counted there were 12, and now they're very, very rare. So presumably, with that form of inquiry, government, parliament, the public, weaned themselves off it and found different ways of making those big decisions. Is that the kind of seminal point, tipping point we've got to here, do you think, where we should be looking at something quite fundamental as an alternative to public inquiries?
I think so. I think the fact that you're having this inquiry is really welcome. I think it's a point of saying, could this lead to rethinking what we do? Is there a different way of doing it? Have we got to a point where we're saying, we can't keep going like this? We need to think about other ways of achieving justice for people, of finding out what went wrong and being sure that we do actually learn the lessons. So I think, yes, this could be an important point.
That point. I hate to dampen your optimism. I think the other problem is, though, that we look back to other parliaments and other public inquiries, they themselves have had a retrospective analysis of other inquiries and identified the shortcomings that we're all identifying here. I think the Thirlwell inquiry looked at past recommendations into healthcare issues and found that many hadn't been acted upon, and then subsequently we see the same happening there. And the Grenfell inquiry recommended a public accessible record of recommendations made by select committees, corners and public inquiries, which government then must use to track the progress of implementation or otherwise explain why it has failed to implement those recommendations. Again, that hasn't happened. And then only last year, the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee held an inquiry like this that, again, probably came to some of the same conclusions that I think we will rightly come to. But one element here, and I think you identified it in relation to Jersey, is there is scepticism about government engagement with public inquiries once they're established. But there shouldn't be the similar level of scepticism about parliamentary engagement and oversight. So is that something, now we don't want to make work for ourselves or we don't want to be accused of a power grab, but on the basis of your experience so far, not I want to short-circuit our inquiry, but is Parliament perhaps the solution to overcoming some of the problems we see here? So rather than government being in the driving seat, once it's established, Parliament has an oversight and ongoing commitment to observing what's happening.
Yes, I think what's important is that in reviewing what the outcome has been in terms of the recommendations, there needs to be a degree of independence in that. You could argue that Parliament is, in that sense, is independent from government, so it could perhaps have that role. But I think whatever happens, there is a real need to look at what can we put in place that will look at the recommendations and what happened and where they followed through. Because I think that's a major gap that we've got at the present time with inquiries. And as you've highlighted, you see things being repeated over and again, and it's not happened. And I think that then undermines public confidence. If there's still a public interest, because that's the other bit about this, is that if it's gone on for all these years, then the people who may have been fired up at the beginning, over many years, maybe kind of lose track of where are we at.
Yeah, I suppose to go back to that issue about Royal Commissions, it was a very yes minister, Sir Humphrey Appleby would call for a Royal Commission to get an issue, kick it into the long grass. Is there an element, therefore, we need greater engagement with the public about this, because their first demand is for an inquiry? A judge seems like an independent person, but actually, if you look at the outcome, 10 or 15 years later, when nothing happens, people have died, victims are left without answers. So really, should this conversation be more inclusive than it is at the moment, and to level with the public that it isn't working for them?
Yes, I think one of the things is we don't know what the public really think, but particularly we don't really know what the parties or the victims have thought about inquiries. Did it serve their purpose at the end of the day? And there are those gaps in our knowledge because we don't do these things routinely.
Yeah, and just finally, just in terms of this issue in relation to judge-led inquiries, Sir John Sturrock in his evidence to us basically, I think, bemoans the fact there's a judicial detailed forensic approach, which I think he calls overly legalistic and which leads to an adversarial system. It doesn't have to be that way, does it? Presumably we can smash this and start again.
I think you can, as I say, in Jersey it worked very effectively when we were, if you like, in inquisitorial mode, sat round the table with people to have a conversation with them, just as we're having just now. That you can probe, you can ask for more, you can get it there. It doesn't need to be in that very formalised questioning by counsel against a statement that's been made. Because one of the concerns was that process often felt like there had been a process of drawing up a statement that had been expensive and what have you, and then what happened when it came into the hearing room was that basically counsel asked the same questions with it. So it felt like this is process rather than engagement with people. I think people need to feel that they are engaged with and that they are able to tell their story. Because an awful lot about inquiries, particularly that are victims, is people need to be able to tell their story.
And just finally, in relation to the kind of mission creep and the budget creep, presumably there would be downsides to setting a budget to the inquiry. And what would the negative consequences of that potentially be, based on your experience?
Well, the danger, obviously, is that you curtail the inquiry and you miss out on what is to be there. I think you can set a budget with the opportunity for that budget to be increased, provided that a case is made out for it. So it doesn't just drift on with that. Which to some extent is in effect what happened in Jersey. From the initial budget of £6 million became apparent that wasn't going to be enough. We had to go back and make representations and say this is why and get that agreed.
That's super, thank you.
Yeah, I should say that New Zealand's investigation into what happened under COVID is a Royal Commission. And it's chaired by an epidemiologist and on the panel is a former government minister and a Treasury Secretary rather than a judge, and they have a deadline of February next year to conclude. Michael.
Thank you, Professor Cameron. It's been very stimulating so far and very useful. Can I ask, on the independent Jersey Care inquiry, why did you take on that role?
I thought it would be interesting. I thought I would have something to contribute from my experience. I had been chairman of the Parole Board for Scotland up until just before that approach was made. Well, I have the opportunity to go and do that. And it was, for me, it was a learning experience. It was a new experience of being in that setting. And it was because of the people we were working with on the panel who had different experiences, then it was a very valuable experience. So it was something that people say to me, that must have been very harrowing. We were dealing with difficult issues. We were hearing difficult evidence, but equally you felt that you had something to contribute. And when it came to the recommendations, then I think what I was able to do was to apply my experience and to here are the things that need to be done as a result of the failings that there had been in the past.
And do you think it was worthwhile?
I think for Jersey it was worthwhile. I think Jersey needed to move on from the global publicity it had attracted over the Haute-Lagarin issue. You may remember that this was where it was believed that bodies had been buried under a children's home. At the end of the day, no bodies were found. There was no evidence of that. But Jersey needed to move on not least of all because of the adverse publicity it was attracting to the island, and that was potentially affecting their trade, their business, being the finance world. So from their point of view, it was worthwhile. Certainly for the victims who felt that they hadn't been heard, they were sceptical at the outset. Would we really delve into the issues? Would we really kind of question people? Would we hold them to account? And at the end of the day, when they saw that that's what we did, then they were very positive about that.
Okay. I mean, Jersey's a population of 100,000 people, £23 million. Yeah. I mean, that you mentioned already the budget restraints within social work departments, and you've led social work departments, and at the same time that those people are protecting lives, social workers in those communities. And you were quite conscious of that, almost, would you call it a trade-off?
Yes, absolutely. I think we were cautious of the cost of this inquiry against the pressures on the budget. People assume that Jersey's a wealthy island. There's a lot of money in Jersey, but they have the same budget constraints in terms of their services. So yes, that was there with it. And I think that's why we particularly felt kind of after the inquiry that we need to revisit some of the work that Alison had begun with SUI, with the Scottish Universities Insight Institute, to look at inquiries and could they be done differently, really on the basis of saying that there has to be a better and more cost-effective way of dealing with these issues.
Okay. I think, following up on some comments and questions that colleagues have made, it strikes me that there's an issue in here about the design of inquiries. I'll maybe come on to method in a moment. But the government is trying to deal with quite often being pushed into a position where there's a lack of trust around potentially the state's role within, whether it be delivery of a service or delivery of justice within its own way. And they have to find a means by which, quite often under pressure, to try and bring some form of solutions to that question. It strikes me that often that there's a bit of a one-size-fits-all process for all this, not just the judge-led, and we've talked about the tendency towards that we've perhaps become fixated on that side of it. But is it possible that just in different fields there are entirely different approaches that might be appropriate to dealing with some of those issues?
I would have thought so. I think the subject matter will vary, and I think what we need to explore are there different models that fit different purposes. The approach to the Edinburgh Trams inquiry, for instance, would be different from the child abuse inquiry, because the Edinburgh Trams inquiry isn't dealing with victims or survivors as such. It's looking into a whole range of technical and legal issues with that. So that's one type of inquiry. Inquiries where there are victims or people who have been directly affected by it, whether it be child abuse, whether it be something like Sheku Bakingbow, Emma Caldwell, whatever. These inquiries may well lend themselves to a different approach.
And in the Scottish system at the moment, who do you think designs the public inquiry?
I think probably each inquiry is designed by its chair at the outset with government in terms of agreeing the terms of reference. How is it going to be set up? And I think that's one of the issues is, could we have a more standardised approach to the design of the inquiry and how it will work?
Okay. So you think that is a discussion between the chair once selected. So there must be a process though where, in essence, the government pre-designs the inquiry because they have to appoint the appropriate person, as we described.
Absolutely.
You know, it might be a senior epidemiologist, as the convener suggested, around a COVID inquiry, or it might be a judge if it were in a legal situation. So there's some preconstruction of what will happen from government in that situation.
I think arguably that's where there would be merit in government having if you like, an array of options available to it about what would work best for this situation, rather than the pressure to go in just one route that we've got a kind of one-size-fits-all approach, but rather say, no, for this issue, this is how we'll approach it.
Would it not be better perhaps if we had, for instance, a judge-led public inquiry unit that then, once the button was pressed by government, the entire design, including who was to be the chair, the independence of the structure was to be passed to that group, who might then be the people who were charged with, for instance, your suggestions about once the budget had reached its threshold, if a case were to be made, it went back?
I think there would be merit, in having an inquiry, a public inquiries unit. Whether it needs to be judge-led or not, a moot point. But certainly a body that could look to develop the approach to inquiries, could deal with the mechanics of the inquiries, could help towards standardisation of some of the processes with it. So it says, here is, if you like, your starter for the inquiry.
I suppose what I'm trying to do in my head is to try and make some assumptions about how we deal with this trust issue.
Yes.
That people are looking for a high bar and threshold. My view around this, I think that the decline in trust in public institutions, politicians, is part of the question here that has to be dealt with and that people are seeking recourse for.
Yes, I think that's where you've got to be sure that whatever process is followed is seen to be credible and it's got integrity, and that the public can have faith in the expertise and the integrity of the people who are leading it. So that's really important.
And you mentioned on then around the issue of method, redaction of documents and so on, and that being charged at an hourly rate for potentially huge screeds of evidence, massive volumes. You don't think that some of that work needs to be done by hourly rated solicitors?
I think we could find other people who could do that, who could be trained to do it, would know what they were doing, and could be employed on the basis of saying they are, if you like, redaction officers who will deal with that, at least the first go. There might be a need for some oversight by legal eyes at the end of the day with that, but a lot of these processes could be done by other people.
Okay. Thank you, Camilla. That's me. But if I can set on record as well, in similar case to Liz Smith, my involvement with a public inquiry as a constituency MSP is providing information and testimony in all likelihood to that inquiry.
Okay, thank you. And Liz, you want to come in with a...
Just one very short question. Do you think Parliament needs to look at the 2005 Inquiries Act?
I think that would be part and parcel of looking at what should the future be.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I really actually found this fascinating, this opening session. I just wonder if there's anything further you wish to add to the evidence you've provided today before we wind up.
No, I think my only thing would be to make the changes will not be easy because there will be resistance to it. But I do believe very strongly that, bearing in mind the need to satisfy victims, for people to feel that this has been worthwhile, is important, and that anything can be changed. It's possible to change it and say, we don't have to do it that way. Having been Director of Social Work in the Borders, I'm very familiar with the phrase, it's I been. And there's a degree to which that applies here, and it says that it doesn't always have to be this way. We can do it differently.
Yes, I don't think we're pushing an open door, I have to be honest with you, but nevertheless, we shall certainly valiantly pursue our aims. So I want to thank you, Professor Cameron, for your very helpful contribution, for taking the time to speak to the committee and for your excellent submission. We'll continue to take evidence on our inquiry next week. We'll hear from 2 panels of witnesses. That concludes the public part of our meeting. The next item on our agenda, which we'll discuss in private, is consideration of our work programme. So we now move into a private session. I'll just call a 5-minute break to allow broadcasting the official report and Professor Cameron to leave. Thank you.